Chapter 23:45. It didn't matter if he apologized or not. The little fox that he was so worried about was coming back soon. Reporting. The soldier's loud voice came from outside the door. Xia Jinyuan turned off the television and opened the door with his long legs. His little fox had arrived at the Border Defense Company's helicopter airport. Xia Jinyuan didn't need the soldier to lead the way. He strode towards the Border Defense Company's airport. On behalf of the military, he was going to welcome the brave Special Forces soldiers back to their country safely. After the helicopter landed, Qin Xiu was the first to come down, followed by Yi Qian, followed by the male soldiers. And the ones who welcomed them back were the soldiers who would always be their strong backing. The deputy commander of the Yun Province military region who sent them off stood at the front of the rows of pine trees. When all the heroes came down, he shouted in a deep voice, "Salute!" Swoosh! In the heavy rain, hundreds of soldiers in combat uniforms raised their hands and saluted at the same time. They saluted quickly and fiercely. Their standard salutes brushed against the wind and rain, bringing with them the fierce and unyielding military might of the soldiers who would never give up. Yi Qian, J5, G3, and more than 10 other Special Forces soldiers faced the grand welcome. They stood at attention and saluted. They used their return to tell the country that they had completed their mission. The whole scene was grand and passionate, making people's eyes turn red. Xia Jinyuan stood not far away and looked at his beloved girl. He looked at his lover who fought side by side with him. He looked at her towering figure standing in the sun. His tightly pressed lips finally lifted into a smile. That was his pride, a pride that he would protect with his life. His girl had grown up. She was no longer a delicate little girl, no longer a little girl who trembled and was afraid of her first target. His girl had become an indomitable and fearless soldier. She used her gun to defend the country's dignity and used bullets to tell those people why China dared to be strong. He accompanied her through the wind and rain and witnessed her metamorphosis again and again. Finally, she broke out of her cocoon and became the most dazzling star. Yi Qian, who had shaken hands with the deputy commander, seemed to feel something. Her gaze passed through the rows of soldiers and landed in the distance. She saw the most familiar figure, tall and slender, as proud as a mountain. Their gazes were separated and even passed by the soldiers. In the crowd, in the mountains and rivers, no matter where you are, my gaze will always find you. Because standing there, you are the target that I will never give up on. Yi Qian, whose face was covered with fine scars, smiled. Her lips curved and her eyes revealed the sweetest, most beautiful, and most gentle smile. Every time she returned, she would always see the figure that he was waiting. Chapter 23:46. As the soldiers left, Xia Jinyuan's figure gradually disappeared from Yi Qian's sight. Yi Qian didn't stay any longer. She said to J5 softly, "Q King is here. I'll go look for him first." His wound was still recovering, and he was standing in the rain waiting for her. She had to hurry over and drag him back to his room. "Q King is here." J5, who didn't notice anything, looked around and asked Yi Qian to leave first. He was one of the few people who knew about their relationship. Yi Qian didn't stay any longer. She followed the soldier's footsteps to look for the figure who left. She didn't need to spend any effort to look for him. The figure who was waiting for her was definitely not far away, quietly waiting for her arrival. Yi Qian walked very quickly without looking back. She didn't notice that there was a gaze following her closely. "Is Yi Qian in a hurry? Why are you in such a hurry?" After talking to the staff sent by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Qin Xiu walked over to J5 and asked in a low voice, "Shouldn't she be changing first?" The rain had been pouring since midnight. Although she was a female soldier, she was still a girl. Walking in the rain for 8 to 9 hours was very bad for a girl's body. J5 naturally wouldn't say that Yi Qian was going to see Xia Jinyuan. He smiled and said, "She's a female soldier. She can't change with us male soldiers. She left in a hurry to change alone." This explanation was very good. Qin Xiu didn't suspect anything. They were going to go back to their rooms to take a shower, rest for a while, and then set off for Beijing. Yi Qian had already seen Xia Jinyuan. The tall and slender man was standing in front of her with a smile on his handsome face. He was looking at her with gentle eyes as he walked over step by step. He stood still and waited for Yi Qian to come to his side. Yi Qian, whose clothes were completely soaked, walked very quickly. Xia Jinyuan could even see water droplets dripping from the corners of her clothes and pants. Her shiny black hair was completely soaked, and it stuck softly to her body, accentuating her fair skin and exquisite facial features. The high-intensity battle did not tire her out at all. Her eyes were bright and shiny like gems. Xia Jinyuan suddenly did not want to stand there anymore. He wanted to go over and hug his lover. He was no longer standing in the corner. He moved his long legs and strode towards her like a shooting star. Yi Qian's smile deepened. He was standing in a blind spot and would not be easily discovered. Now that he had walked out, any soldiers passing by would be able to see him. So what if she saw him? A hug at such a time was not just a hug of lovers reuniting, but a hug of a comrade returning safely. As he strode over, Yi Qian couldn't help but trot over. Yi Qian still had an injury on his waist, so he had to be careful. Xia Jinyuan did not care about his injury. It was precisely because of his injury that he did not participate in this operation. When he found out about the new policies of the neighboring country and the shameless scheme of the military group, he really wanted to grab 2 guns and rush to the neighboring country. Now that the lover he was worried about was back, he did not care about his injury. When he got closer, Xia Jinyuan's handsome face darkened slightly. There were several thin streaks of blood on her fair face. The longest one ran from the corner of her eye to her chin. After being drenched in the rain, the area around the wound was already red and swollen, showing signs of inflammation. Xia Jinyuan gently touched her wound with his fingers. His thin lips were tightly pursed as he wrapped his long arms around her and pulled her tightly into his embrace. His tall and straight body arched slightly and hugged Yi Qian like a harbor. Yi Qian could not help but gently close her eyes. His warm embrace made her tense body and mind completely relax. Chapter 23:47. His embrace was her harbor. She felt more at ease now that she had returned to her harbor. "Congratulations, Qing Miao." He hugged her tightly and called out her code name in a low voice. This was a hug between comrades in arms, not a hug between lovers. Yi Qian took a deep breath of his refreshing scent and opened her eyes. She smiled and replied, "Thank you. I made you worry." He was indeed worried, but he also felt proud. "My little girl has grown up. I'm proud of you, little fox." Xia Jinyuan couldn't bear to let go of her in his arms. Her small and soft body was in his arms. Instantly, all the emptiness in his heart was filled. He truly felt that she was back, safe and sound. He felt a little helpless. He clearly told her that no matter who went out to fight, the people who stayed behind should wait patiently. There was no need to worry, no need to be afraid, even if they had to sacrifice themselves. That was the path a soldier should take. But when he found out that she had gone out to fight alone, accompanied the Chinese ambassador to a war-torn country without any equipment, he felt as if his heart had been struck by a heavy object. It was so painful that his heart stopped beating. Waiting was a scary thing. It was torturous both physically and mentally. If he wanted to get used to fighting separately, he had to get used to it too. Yi Qian felt his arm tremble slightly and knew that he had been worried about her. She patted his broad back gently and said softly, "Because you are my goal. I have to work hard to catch up to you. I can't let you wait too long." This little fox, sometimes she was so silly that it made his heart ache. Just because she knew that he had suppressed his promotion, she felt sorry for herself. She didn't feel sorry for herself either. She felt sorry for herself and how tired she would be if she worked so hard. Those cuts on her face, didn't she hurt? She still had the mind to catch up to him. He couldn't bear to see her tired, but sometimes he could only stand by and watch her tire. He lowered his head and kissed her temple. "Go back to your room and change first. Rest for the night and I'll send you back to school tomorrow. Your school leaders have called the military and hope that you can go back as soon as possible to prepare for the drill in May." Compared to a cadet, Yi Qian had taken too many days off. The academy leaders were worried that if he kept taking days off like this, Yi Qian's results would be unstable. Qin Xiu, who was holding an umbrella in his hand, looked at the leaving figure quietly. Through the curtain of rain, he looked a little dignified. He wanted to give her an umbrella, but what he saw was... She was jogging impatiently, like a swallow returning to the forest, into the arms of a man in military uniform. Between heaven and earth, it was as if only that pair of figures hugging each other existed, and he was an intruder who saw a scene that he shouldn't have seen. Lover. Comrade. He suddenly felt a little uncertain, but in his heart, he hoped that it was her comrade and not her lover. J5 walked over and saw Qin Xiu's hand holding the umbrella's rib a bit tightened. Looking at the two figures leaving, J5 felt his eyelids suddenly twitch as an incredible thought flashed across his mind. It can't be. Impossible. Did he make a mistake? Was he thinking too much? The ambassador likes Qing Miao. Happy Qing Miao. J5 felt his eyelids twitch even harder. Things can't develop like this, Qing Miao. Q King had his eyes on her a long time ago. He had been waiting for her for several years. But he couldn't explain anything now. J5 pretended not to see and smiled. "Ambassador, let's go back to our room and change as soon as possible. It's not easy to come back home, we don't want to catch a cold." Chapter 23:48. Qin Xiu, whose chest felt heavy, lowered his eyes slightly and quickly concealed the undercurrent in his eyes. He smiled faintly and said, "Okay." He wanted to ask who the man who hugged Yi Qian was, but when the words came out of his mouth, he found it difficult to say them. He had to admit that he was a little timid. He was afraid that he would ask the answer he didn't want to hear the most. J5 didn't want to say anything. He held the umbrella and walked with a natural expression, as if what he saw just now was nothing out of the ordinary. Fortunately, the two of them knew their limits and separated after hugging. If the ambassador really wanted to ask, he could explain that it was a comrade in the military. Otherwise, it would be really hard to explain. He had to remind the two of them later that they had to exercise more restraint. They were in a secret relationship. Even a simple hug would reveal a different kind of sweetness. It would be best if they didn't hug each other so that others wouldn't be able to tell that something was going on. All of a sudden, J5 felt that he was very worried. Previously, because Yi Qian was still underage, he was worried that Xia Jinyuan would break the rules and date an underage girl. Now that Yi Qian was an adult, he was still worried. Yi Qian was a military school student. How could he date? If that was the case, he would have to continue worrying until Yi Qian graduated. In the meantime, he would probably have to cover for the two of them. It was tiring. He was a worrisome person. Even when his comrades were in a relationship, he had to be on tenterhooks about it. When they reached the second floor of the Border Defense Company, J5 breathed a sigh of relief. Along the way, the diplomatic ambassador, who had a verbal battle with a neighboring country's negotiator, remained cold and calm. He didn't say anything and just walked slowly. Every step he took was extremely steady. It looked like he was strolling in the rain, happy and carefree. In fact, that wasn't the case at all. Walking beside him, J5 could clearly feel that the ambassador's aura had become very fierce. It swept away his elegant temperament and was even more powerful than yesterday's negotiation. Previously, J5 thought that he was overthinking things. Now, it seemed that he didn't expect it at all. This outstanding diplomat was really interested in Yi Qian. That's right, Yi Qian was really attractive. Especially those who were extremely outstanding, such as Q King, they would all be attracted to her. Now, with the addition of an outstanding diplomat, J5 was not surprised. Qin Xiu closed the umbrella and gently shook off the water droplets on the umbrella. He smiled at J5 and said, "Thank you for your hard work these days. Have a good rest. See you later." "You're welcome, Ambassador." J5 closed his umbrella and replied calmly, "See you later." Qin Xiu's room was on the second floor, while J5 and the others were on the first floor. J5 stood still and politely watched Qin Xiu go upstairs with the umbrella. Watching the ambassador walk up the stairs step by step, J5 couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. However, before he could completely relax, he saw the ambassador suddenly turn around. J5's nerves tensed up. He looked at the ambassador's face, which was drenched by the rain but still looked exceptionally elegant, as if it had been carved from fine jade. The ambassador asked him with a faint smile, "Which room is Yi Qian in?" "What happened to not asking? Why did you ask?" J5 smiled and said, "She came back earlier than all of us. I'm not too sure which room she's in. Is there something you need from her, Ambassador?" "I want to ask if she's returning to the capital or returning to the academy. I want to see if she needs to explain the reason for her leave to the academy. If necessary, I plan to accompany her back to the academy," Qin Xiu said with a smile. J5's heart tightened when he heard this. It seemed that this ambassador was suspicious. "Rest assured, Ambassador. Yi Qian's mission is arranged by the military. The military has already communicated clearly with the academy, so there's no need to trouble you, Ambassador," J5 replied calmly. His tone was normal, and there was nothing strange about it. Chapter 2349. Seeing this, Qin Xiu didn't ask any more questions. There were some things that didn't need to be asked in detail. Just by looking at it, he already had the answer. Without asking any more questions, Qin Xiu said, "See you later." Then he turned and went upstairs. When he looked up, there was a faint darkness in his eyes. He didn't need to get the answer from someone else. He wanted to hear Yi Qian tell herself. But what right did he have to ask about her personal matters? Facing an outstanding diplomat from another country who was deliberately making things difficult for him, he felt unprecedentedly confused about his children's affairs. If Yi Qian really had a boyfriend, what would he do? Give up? Or continue to pursue her? Knowing that she already had a boyfriend, if he continued to pursue her, wouldn't he be an immoral third party? Psychologically, he couldn't get over this hurdle. But when he thought about giving up, Qin Xiu closed the door, but his slender fingers holding the umbrella didn't put it down. Qin Xiu's fingers were very slender, and his joints were as delicate as his person. Even though he was holding the umbrella tightly, the lines of his fingers were still beautiful. After a while, he put the umbrella in the corner with a cold expression. He took off his suit and unbuttoned his white shirt while thinking about walking towards the bathroom. Giving up was also difficult. He couldn't go against his morals, and he didn't want to give up. Then let's just leave it at that. He would pretend that he didn't know anything, that nothing had happened, and let nature take its course. After turning on the shower head, Qin Xiu raised his head and let the warm water splash on his face. Soon, the bathroom was filled with steam. Amidst the sound of the water, the man's slender but graceful body was faintly discernible in the steam. Qin Xiu, who had been learning Sanda for a long time, was also a classic example of a man who looked thin in clothes, but had great body when he took them off. Yi Qian, who came back earlier than him, had already finished washing up. She sat on the edge of the bed and dried her hair by herself with a hairdryer. There was no one in the room. The man who came back with her saw the countless small cuts on her palm. His eyes were clouded and he went out to get the first aid kit. With some pain on her face, Yi Qian put down the hairdryer and went to the bathroom to look in the mirror. She saw a few bloody cuts from the shrubbery on her face. The cuts from the corner of her eyes to the side of her jaw were the most conspicuous. Her skin was the kind of skin that wouldn't get tan no matter how much it was in the sun in her previous and current life. After being drenched for 8 or 9 hours, her originally fair skin was sickly pale, and this made the bloody cuts on her face even more. There were many wounds, and there were signs of inflammation. No wonder Captain Xia immediately sent him back to his room to get the first aid kit. She had to treat it. Although she didn't really care if there was a scar on her face, she couldn't let the wound get infected. Yi Qian's in the bathrooms to see Xia carrying the first aid medicines doctor, S.A. doctor. Yi Qian nodded her head in satisfaction when she saw that he had changed into his military uniform and was now dry. S2's at AA have they been taken care to be treated? To treat to have it be treated to be treated, T-test to be taken care of those wounds T-S treated S's treated Z's. Xia Jinyuan couldn't help but sigh when he saw how worried she was about the wound on her waist. His gaze fell on the wound on her face, and he reached out to hold her wrist. Mine's fine. It's already scabbed over. You're the one who's in trouble. Come here and treat the wound on your face first. There are still 2 broken shards stuck into your flesh at the corner of your eye. Don't you feel it? 2 more shards stuck into her flesh. She really didn't feel it. Chapter 2350. She subconsciously wanted to touch it, but she suddenly stumbled into his arms. As she fell into his arms, she heard his low voice say helplessly, "You still want to touch it? Do you want to pierce it deeper and leave a memento?" Seeing her injured, whether it was a big injury or a small one, his heart ached. He knew that it was inevitable, but his heart still ached. He wanted to put her in the palm of his hand to dote on and pamper her, but he had to let go because of his profession. He wanted to see her get hurt, see her suffer, and see her suffer. It was said that one could not see the rainbow without going through the rain. As Special Forces soldiers, they might not be able to see the rainbow even if they went through the rain. The next second, it might be eternal darkness, and they might not be able to see the sun tomorrow. He and she were Special Forces soldiers who had gone through storms and walked on the edge of the blade. They were calm when facing their own injuries, but in the eyes of the other party, they were heartbroken. He also knew how much her heart ached when she saw the injury on his waist. He also knew how worried she was when he went missing. Yi Qian did not touch it again. She threw herself into his arms and said with a smile, "Don't leave such a small injury as a memento. The injuries on your body are the real memento." Hearing her indifferent tone, Xia Jinyuan felt bitter in his heart. He also wanted to protect her well and make sure that she did not get hurt at all. He also wanted to face all the dangers in the war, and she only needed to stand behind him. He also wanted to, but he only wanted to. He lowered his head and kissed the girl who did not want to get up from his arms. His warm lips kissed her softly on her forehead. Brave little fox, let's pick out the thorns first. I'll let you hug me when we're on the bed. Let her hug me when we're on the bed. Yi Qian glanced at the 1.5-meter double bed from the corner of her eye. With his height of 1.8 meters, he would have to curl up to lie on it. The curtains were drawn in the room, and Xia Jinyuan turned on the bedside lamp. He carefully looked at the 2 thorns that pierced the corners of her eyes. They were a little too deep. The needle used to stitch up the wound was disinfected with alcohol. His fingers gently pressed against the corner of her eyes. His deep and dark eyes stared at the few deep thorns. He said softly, "The thorns are a little deep. It will hurt to take them out. Bear with it." The thorns pierced into the flesh instantly, so there wouldn't be much pain. Especially when she was fully focused on the battle, she didn't even feel anything when the thorns cut her face. It was a little painful to use the needle to pick out the thorns in the flesh. When the tip of the needle touched the hard thorns gently, Xia Jinyuan saw Yi Qian's long and black eyelashes flutter. He subconsciously blew on the thorns as if to coax a child that it wouldn't hurt. He even coaxed gently, "It doesn't hurt, it doesn't hurt. Be good, it won't hurt in a while." Yi Qian couldn't help but laugh out loud at the way she was trying to coax a 3-year-old. When she laughed, the corners of her eyes twitched, scaring Xia Jinyuan so much that she quickly moved the needle away from her hand so as not to stab her. "Be serious. You're not allowed to laugh." He pretended to be angry and spoke with a threatening face, but in less than 2 seconds, he broke his facade. His handsome face was gentle as he continued to coax her. "It'll be fine soon. It's not 2 thorns, but 3. It's been stuck in your flesh for so long, and you've been drenched in water for a few hours. The wound is too close to the corner of your eyes. Don't let it fester and hurt your eyes." He usually didn't have time to take care of her. Now that he was by her side, as her boyfriend, he naturally had to take good care of her. Yi Qian didn't move again. The sharp needle had touched the edge of her eyelashes just now, so she wasn't afraid that it would fester and hurt her eyes. She was afraid that if she laughed again, the tip of the needle would accidentally poke her eyes. Chapter 2351. Every Special Forces soldier knew how to perform simple suturing operations. Removing a thorn was a piece of cake. After removing all 3 thorns, there were 3 bloody cotton balls on the stainless steel plate. The thorns were indeed deep, but fortunately, they weren't long. It wasn't much of a problem to remove them with iodine. His face, palms, elbows, and knees were all injured to varying degrees. The most shocking injury on his leg was the injury on his calf. After a night, the injury on his calf was bruised, and there were even purple spots of blood on it. Xia Jinyuan didn't say a word as he poured safflower oil onto his hands. He rubbed them until his palms were hot, then he pressed them against Yi Qian's calf and rubbed them. Yi Qian didn't even know when he had been hit. He lay on the bed and endured the pain while Xia Jinyuan rubbed away the blood clots. Slowly, his calf began to feel a burning sensation. The warm energy brought an indescribable sense of comfort. You don't have experience fighting alone in the jungle, but the J5 soldiers do. Why didn't they remind you to check your body for injuries that need treatment? If it's inconvenient to use safflower oil, they should at least spray it with painkillers. Your skin is fair to begin with. Even a slight bump would leave a bruise. Now that you're bleeding under your skin, the J5 soldiers on the helicopter should have reminded you to treat it. Xia Jinyuan's deep voice was a little tense. If you listened carefully, you could faintly hear the anger in his voice. She didn't know if the oil had a hypnotic effect, but the warm energy slowly crept up from her calf to her head. The warmth was exceptionally comfortable, and even her drowsiness slowly crept up. Yi Qian listened indifferently. The corners of his lips curled up as he replied, "It's okay. It's not as serious as the last time you kicked me. The bruises you left behind last time only disappeared after the new year." Xia Jinyuan's right hand, which was rubbing her calf, paused. He felt helpless. He wasn't afraid of anything since he was young. He could do whatever he wanted outside the house and had been like this for the past 20 years. Until now, there was only one thing he was afraid of. He didn't look up. He poured the safflower oil and rubbed the bruises on her calf. He smiled helplessly and said, "Little fox, are you remembering? What should I do? What do I have to do for you to forget?" She was talking about last year's training with the Marine Storm team. In order to teach her how to play tricks on the battlefield, he taught her a lesson. His purpose was to let her remember that there was no such thing as playing tricks on the battlefield. Only true abilities were needed. Who would have thought that she would still remember it after more than 2 months? Now, he was afraid that she would mention it. Your boyfriend is really ruthless. It's hard to forget him. Yi Qian answered in a muffled voice. Lying on the bed, Yi Qian's breathing gradually became longer. By the time Xia Jinyuan raised his head to ask what he should do, Yi Qian had already fallen asleep. She was too tired after 2 consecutive nights of high-intensity combat. Now that she had returned to the safe harbor, she couldn't stop herself from falling asleep. Xia Jinyuan's hands didn't stop moving. Looking at her sleepy face, he realized that she didn't really want to argue with him when she mentioned it. At the same time, he reminded himself that it was normal for him to have bumps and bruises during training and combat. It had nothing to do with his comrades. On the other hand, he was a little scared. Although he was a little scared, if he had to choose again, his choice would still be the same and wouldn't change. The room was very quiet. It was a peaceful time to enjoy. Xia Jinyuan's hands moved until he pushed the purple blood away. Chapter 2352. She was wearing a short-sleeved shirt and shorts, and the room was slightly cold. In order to prevent Yi Qian from catching a cold, Xia Jinyuan carefully placed her legs on the bed and gently covered her with the quilt. He carefully twisted the corners of the quilt before getting up. He put away the medicine and opened the curtains to let in the fresh, moist air to disperse the smell of medicine in the room so that she could sleep better. After he was done, Xia Jinyuan did not go to bed to rest. Instead, he sat quietly in the lounge chair alone. His handsome face was slightly cold, and he seemed to be thinking about something. If J5 did not knock on the door, he would probably sit there until Yi Qian woke up. Is Yi Qian asleep? J5 heard Xia Jinyuan open the door very softly, so he knew that Yi Qian was asleep. He pointed to his room and said with a slightly serious expression, "Come to my room to talk about something." J5's room was next door. Because he had just taken a shower, there was a faint smell of soap in the room. After pouring tea, J5 sat down and frowned. He said in a deep voice, "The ambassador might have noticed the relationship between you and Yi Qian." Before he went back to his room, he asked me if Yi Qian would return to Beijing. If not, he planned to send Yi Qian back to school. Q King, not only did he discover something, but he also seems to be interested in Yi Qian. Qin Xiu and Yi Qian seem to be interested in each other. Xia Jinyuan focused on this sentence. How can you tell that he is interested in Yi Qian? The two of you hugged each other in the rain. TSK TSK TSK, it shocked the world and made the gods cry. Anyone with eyes can see that there is something going on between the two of you. What's more, he seems to be interested in Yi Qian. J5 glared at him, but in the blink of an eye, he gloated, Q King, your competitor this time isn't just ordinarily strong. V8 told me that the ambassador had a verbal battle with 2 negotiators from a neighboring country. His aura was fierce, and he didn't give in to the country's dignity. When he was offended, he pressed on and made the other party speechless. Yi Qian was there at the time. He was full of admiration for Qin Xiu. With such a strong rival in love, Q King, you have to be careful. Just because of this, he had to be careful. Xia Jinyuan stretched his legs lazily and leaned back in his seat. Even his voice sounded nonchalant as he said, "My relationship with Yi Qian is not something that can be attracted to Yi Qian with just one exciting negotiation. I'm just a little surprised. Qin Xiu is interested in Yi Qian, but I didn't notice it at all." "You're quite confident. Overconfidence is arrogance. Don't be too proud. If you ask me, the ambassador has a better chance of winning than you." J5 poured cold water on Qin Xiu without hesitation and listed out his good points. "Handsome, you don't have to say it. You can see for yourself. His temperament is as elegant as the nobles sitting in the palace. He's witty and knowledgeable. He knows when to advance and when to retreat. He knows how to behave himself. Most importantly, he's a diplomat. He also fights for the country, but his sacrifice rate is lower than ours. He also has more holidays than us. Most importantly, his focus is on the country. As long as he has the time and the heart, he can fly to the military academy to visit Yi Qian in the night." Q King, what do you think your chances of winning are?" "If you ask me, you have the advantage in terms of time." The analysis was not bad. It did sound very threatening. But so what? The love between him and the little fox was not based on romance, nor was it based on time spent together. Their love was completely based on the fact that they were willing to put their lives in each other's hands. They were willing to fight side by side and vanquish their enemies together. Chapter 2353. Through the smoke of war, through the flames of war, his and Little Fox's love wasn't something that could be easily interfered with. Xia Jinyuan raised his eyes. His disdainful gaze was filled with the unruffled domineering aura of a powerhouse. He spoke cheerfully and wittily with an irresistible force. "So what? He likes Yi Qian. I can only say that he has good taste. But that's his own business. What does it have to do with me and Yi Qian?" Such confidence, with a hint of arrogance, made J5 click his tongue. "Q King, I couldn't tell. Back then, you were so afraid that Yi Qian would be pursued by others, but now you're so confident. You're actually not worried about Yi Qian being pursued by other men at all. I don't believe that when you heard me say that the ambassador is interested in Yi Qian, you didn't feel nervous at all," J5 said with certainty. Then, he looked at Xia Jinyuan without blinking, trying to discover something. Before he could discover anything, the domineering Lieutenant Colonel Xia frowned and admitted, "A little, but it's okay. My girlfriend is so outstanding. There will probably be more flies flying around in the future. I have to work harder." "Not nervous." Nonsense. How could he not be nervous? Qin Xiu, one of the top young masters in the capital, a language genius, the youngest diplomat, the most handsome diplomat, the most promising diplomat. His long list of most was enough to make people's eyes linger. Just as J5 said, he was lucky that he won in terms of time. If the young Qin Xiu and the young Yi Qian met. Lieutenant Colonel Xia's eyes darkened. Then, he really wouldn't know whose girlfriend Little Fox was. It wasn't that he was belittling himself, but Qin Xiu was indeed very outstanding. His character was also quite good. Among the young masters in the capital who didn't have any scandals, Qin Xiu was one of them. Even the old man at home said that Qin Xiu alone was enough to support the Qin family. Apart from family Xia and his children, Old Master Qin had only commented on 2 other people. One was Xia Jinyuan's brother-in-law, Li Jinyan, and the other was Qin Xiu from the Qin family, who was worthy of being a role model in Beijing. From this, it could be seen how outstanding Qin Xiu was. Wasn't he nervous? How could he not be nervous? But this kind of thing couldn't be solved just by being nervous. The main thing was to let the other party know the difficulty and back off. Here came the problem. His current identity was still that of a boyfriend who couldn't see the light of day. How could he make her back off? J5 saw that he was deep in thought, and his eyes flashed with a teasing smile. Suddenly, he thought of a very important thing. Something was wrong. What he wanted to say was not that the ambassador had taken a liking to Yi Qian. Why was it that he and Q King were analyzing the chances of the ambassador winning? His main point was that the ambassador had found out about the relationship between Q King and Yi Qian. Stop. Let's not talk about whether the ambassador will become your love rival and make you feel threatened. Q King, our main point now is how you're going to deal with the ambassador if he finds out about your relationship with Yi Qian. This was a very serious matter. Although the military academy didn't explicitly state that students weren't allowed to date, everyone knew that dating in the military academy had a bad influence. Once the academy found out, they would come out and talk to the students first. The military academy students were the future of the country's national defense, and they were also the backbone of the country. During their time in school, all of their energy should be spent on their studies. From a personal point of view, it was understandable why military academy students would date, but from a national point of view, love would always come second. Chapter 2354. Yi Qian was so outstanding that J5 didn't want her relationship to leave a bad mark on her military academy career. He was worried that as more and more people found out, Yi Qian would be implicated in the end. You too, Sai, why don't you continue to bear with it? Meet less, chat less, and travel less together. If you really need to meet, why don't you bring a few more comrades with you? What if the two of you travel together and there's a bit of distance between them? Don't let others see any signs. J5, who was worried sick, came up with one idea after another. It could be seen that he was really thinking for Xia Jinyuan and Yi Jian. However, Xia Jinyuan had already considered this matter, so it wasn't a big problem for him. However, because Yi Qian was worried that her relationship would affect the academy, he understood her concerns and respected her decision. Seeing J5's serious expression and unconcealed worry, Xia Jinyuan smiled and said, Qin Xiu, although I'm not familiar with him, I believe he's not the kind of person to gossip. Since he discovered something but didn't ask any of you, it's obvious that he's not someone who likes to ask about other people's private affairs. The Qin family has strict rules. If he really likes Yi Qian and discovers my relationship with Yi Qian, I think with his upbringing, he won't do anything immoral to interfere with other people's relationships. After all, he's a diplomat who represents the image of the country, not an ordinary person. Anyone who interferes with their relationship would be a third party. With Qin Xiu's upbringing and pride, he wouldn't allow himself to become a third party. After hearing Xia Jinyuan's detailed explanation, J5 felt that he was worrying for nothing. He yawned and waved his hand with a tired expression. I have to go to sleep. When the situation in the northern land stabilizes, we should return to the base and prepare for the overseas competition. Xia Jinyuan didn't intend to leave yet. He raised his eyebrows and said with a faint smile, I haven't asked you anything yet. Why are you in such a hurry to sleep? We haven't seen each other in a while. Let's catch up and have a chat. J5 stood up with his hands on the armrest of the chair and slowly sat back down. What do you want to talk about? Or do you want to ask me something? Since he didn't even let him rest, it was clear that he had something to ask. I want to know more about Qing Niao's performance in this operation, Xia Jinyuan said. If he didn't want to ask about Yi Qian, he wouldn't disturb his comrade's rest. He crossed his slender fingers and there was still a faint smile on his handsome face, but the darkness in his eyes was slightly darker. This is the first time she has received a mission to protect the safety of an important person. I want to know some details about her operation this time. She probably wanted to know if Qing Niao had any shortcomings. The smile on J5's face disappeared, and his expression gradually turned serious. Qing Niao's performance has always exceeded our expectations. She's very calm, and her reaction speed is amazing. When did she have car training? This time, we were surrounded by more than 10 cars. Her driving skills were eye-opening. A one-sided breakout from the encirclement has truly shocked all of us. There's a car training ground in the southern province. She basically spent all her time there during high school. Xia Jinyuan saw the unconcealed admiration in his comrade's eyes when he mentioned Yi Qian, so he knew that his little fox had performed well in this operation. His thin lips curved slightly, and there was a faint smile in his dark eyes. She seems to have an extraordinary talent for combat training. As long as there's a start to any training, the follow-up will always surprise us again and again. Chapter 2355. Then we were right. When she broke out of the encirclement, Old V, Old K, and I also guessed that Qing Niao must have undergone professional special operations vehicle training in the southern province. Talent. J5 let out a long sigh. Her talent isn't just focused on one type, it's all round. Take a look at her shooting skills. No one in our team has reached her level of shooting so far. When she gets a gun, there's a three-dimensional image of the gun in her mind. It's even a living one. She can clearly feel where the bullet passes and where it goes. She can complete the shot without deliberately aiming. Q King, Qing Niao's talent, is amazing. Even a veteran like him was envious. Xia Jinyuan raised his eyebrows. This was natural. Otherwise, how could Little Fox have carried out so many important missions before reaching the age of puberty and still be remembered by the Navy commander? His Little Fox was an all-rounder talent. Judging from your expression, Qing Niao's mission this time was not bad. What about her shortcomings? From the perspective of a veteran Special Forces soldier like you, what does she need to improve? Or does she need to improve? Xia Jinyuan had heard a lot of praises for Yi Qian. He wanted to know if she had any shortcomings. Only by constantly discovering her shortcomings could she continue to improve. J5, I need to know if she has any shortcomings. Please tell me carefully and seriously, Xia Jinyuan said slowly, word by word. There was an indescribable coldness in his voice. Sensing his seriousness, J5 couldn't help but straighten his back. At present, Yi Qian has no shortcomings. As if he had something to say, Xia Jinyuan pursed his lips. But there are still shortcomings. Please ask. There were too many uncertainties in a mission. With him by their side, he couldn't guarantee that their lives would not be in danger. Without him by her side, when he couldn't see, he only hoped that she could cooperate well with her comrades and return safely. Qing Niao is more suited for individual actions. As for group actions, although we cooperated well and completed the battle beautifully, we were always worried that she would suddenly rush out and complete a mission by herself. I think it's because we haven't been training together for a long time. She's not in the army, so she can't participate in our daily coordination and training. It's normal for such a problem to occur. In the future, when she joins the army and trains with us, these problems will naturally be solved. Yi Qian's individual combat ability was so strong that sometimes the J5 and the others could not keep up with her. And Yi Qian was a sniper who had been trained by Principal Qin, a world-class sniper. An individual's independence was greater than the group's training. Therefore, the other comrades were worried that she would suddenly finish the mission ahead of schedule. There were two problems. First, although Yi Qian had established a tacit understanding with the Snowfield Brigade, it was only the beginning. She had not established a tacit understanding with all her comrades, so there was a certain degree of unfamiliarity. Second, Yi Qian was not used to working as a group, or rather, working with the group to complete the mission. She completed the mission too quickly, so the comrades behind her could not keep up with her. The two problems were actually one problem: the tacit understanding was not good enough. Chapter 2356. Xia Jinyuan, who had already figured out the reason, fell silent. After a long time, he pursed his thin lips and said, "Our teamwork still needs to be improved. After we go back, I'll redo the weekly training plan." Qing Niao's individual combat ability is strong, which means that the combat ability of the male soldiers still needs to be improved. We can't slow down and wait for the male soldiers just because her individual combat ability is too strong. Our training is only about chasing, not waiting. J5, you're the vice captain. You'll take the lead to improve our individual combat ability. Yes, sir. J5 nodded and said seriously, after the battle with Qing Niao, I've also been thinking about this. We need to improve our individual combat ability as soon as possible. Otherwise, we won't be able to take on any high-risk missions in the future. Even though the Snowfield Brigade was now the top special forces in the country, if they didn't innovate and work hard, they would be eliminated. They trained for war and to win. Only by improving their individual combat ability day after day, year after year, could they continue to stay in the Snowfield Brigade. Qing Niao's strong individual combat ability was also a warning to them. With J5 in charge, Xia Jinyuan was very relieved. Seeing that they had been delayed for a long time, Xia Jinyuan got up and prepared to go back to his room to accompany Yi Qian. J5 got up and asked him, "Have you informed Yi Qian about the overseas competition? She's the only female soldier in our team. You should know that, right? I only found out yesterday." "You rest, I'll go back to my room." Xia Jinyuan didn't want to disturb his comrade's rest. He stood up and patted his comrade's shoulder. "You don't have to worry too much about Yi Qian and me. You don't have to worry about Qin Shou either. If he really asks, tell him to come and ask me himself. My relationship with Yi Qian. Anyway, it won't affect anything just because he's an outstanding diplomat. I'll keep an eye on him and won't let him take advantage of me." After he finished speaking, he walked back to Yi Qian's room with big, elegant steps. J5 couldn't help but laugh when he saw this. What he said made sense, but in reality, he was still a little nervous. After all, his love rival was very powerful and not an ordinary person. As a comrade in arms, he naturally stood on Q King's side. He was not happy that Yi Qian was snatched away by the ambassador. The ambassador was very outstanding, but no matter how outstanding he was, he could not be compared to his comrade in arms who fought side by side with him. After returning to his room, Xia Jinyuan gently closed the door and walked to the bed. He saw that the girl he liked was still in her original position, and even the smile on her face had not disappeared. She was sleeping soundly. Xia Jinyuan didn't know that the second he saw Yi Jian, his eyes had become exceptionally soft. Even his heart felt like it was swimming in a pool of water. His military aura became soft and soft. He was a hot-blooded soldier who fought for the country, but he was also an ordinary man who was filled with tenderness when facing the girl he loved. After taking off his military jacket, Xia Jinyuan lay down on the bed very gently. As soon as he covered himself with the quilt, Yi Qian, who was sleeping soundly, took the initiative to move closer to his arms like a little animal. She then moved a little and found a more comfortable position to continue sleeping. Xia Jinyuan looked at her, who was sleeping soundly, with a defenseless and innocent smile on her face. He couldn't help but laugh. This little girl was quite proactive. He was still thinking about how to make her sleep in his arms without waking her up. Now that she took the initiative to move closer to him, he was pleasantly surprised. It also showed that even though she was sleeping soundly, she knew that the person lying next to her was him. This kind of reliance that was like a natural instinct made Xia Jinyuan very satisfied. Chapter 23:57. He gently caressed her shoulders with his hand from the back of her neck. His dark eyes were filled with a gentle smile. He lowered his head and kissed the top of her head. Sleep well, little one. Throughout the journey, it could be said that she was solely responsible for Qin Xiu's personal safety. J5 and the others were responsible for the perimeter. Yi Qian's contribution to not injuring Qin Xiu despite being heavily surrounded was undeniable. This also showed that she had the dedication of a soldier. Such Yi Qian made Xia Jinyuan feel proud and heartbroken at the same time. With Xia Jinyuan by her side, Yi Qian slept very soundly and peacefully. With him by her side, she didn't have to think about anything. She could sleep and eat whenever she wanted. She was relaxed and carefree. She really enjoyed this kind of leisure time together. Xia Jinyuan was in good spirits. During this period of recuperation, he had made up for all the sleep he had lost. Now that his girlfriend was lying in his arms and he was hugging her soft body, his heart was filled with tenderness. He closed his eyes for a while, then slowly opened them again to look at Yi Qian's sleeping face. He didn't rest at all and was thinking about something. Qin Xiu was also a man of character. As for his taste, it was extraordinary. However, after meeting Little Fox a few times, he fell in love with her. Just as J5 said, Qin Xiu was a very strong love rival. His love rival was too strong, and he worked in the country. If he wanted to, he could go to the military academy to look for Little Fox at any time. With his ability, going there once or twice a month was not a problem. However, his Little Fox wasn't stupid. If Qin Xiu really went to look for her frequently, she would definitely notice. When that time came, she would avoid him and Qin Xiu wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Just like how he used to chase her. If he didn't chase her to a corner and leave her with no way out, she would never show up easily. Xia Jinyuan gently tapped the tip of her nose with his slender fingers. Thinking of the appearance of a strong rival in love, he smiled indulgently and said, "Little thing, you've only carried out a mission, but you've already attracted a lot of attention. Tell me, why are you so likable?" Qin Xiu, the youngest and most promising diplomat. He also has a handsome face that even I have to admit. If you really take another look at him, my heart will definitely ache for a long time. Little thing, I'm going to be jealous for half a day. You're doomed. If I become jealous for half a day, I'll torture you so much that you won't be able to leave the bed for the whole day. You can't even look at other men. I, Xia Jinyuan, have always been arrogant. Now that you've taught me a lesson, you have to take responsibility. When you look at a man, you can only look at your own man, understand? Lieutenant Colonel Xia did not speak. He spoke softly, seemingly helpless, but in reality, every word he said was filled with affection. As he spoke, Lieutenant Colonel Xia narrowed his unfathomable black eyes. His gaze was like that of a large, ferocious beast, his eyes twinkling with fragmented light. He felt a little insecure, so he had to think of a way to make himself feel safe. Therefore, when Yi Qian opened her eyes, she saw a handsome face that was filled with faint sadness. Yi Qian blinked gently and naturally leaned into his embrace. Did I sleep for a long time? I seem to be able to sleep well with you by my side. Lieutenant Colonel Xiao loved to hear such sweet nothings. His thin lips curved as he laughed softly and said, "It's all right. It hasn't been that long since the sky turned dark. You probably slept for 9 hours. 9 hours. She actually slept for 9 hours. Yi Qian widened her eyes in disbelief. She propped herself up with one hand and looked out the window. The sky really did turn dark. This was not a normal sleep. No wonder she felt hungry when she opened her eyes. From last night until now, she had only drunk a few mouthfuls of water and had not eaten any dry food. Chapter 23:58. Come, let's get up and eat something first. The warm bedside lamp went off. Xia Jinyuan stretched out his long arm and turned on the main light in the room. The bright light illuminated the entire room, allowing Yi Qian to see the sadness on his face more clearly. Captain Xia, something's not right. After washing up, Yi Qian, who had changed into her uniform because it was cold, sat down to eat the military meal. After taking a bite of the meal, she looked up at Xia Jinyuan, who was staring at her deeply. When she was half full, Yi Qian couldn't help but ask him, "I've seen Captain Xia's rascally, arrogant, domineering, and murderous side, but this is the first time I've seen a sad side of you. I'm a little surprised, so I want to ask you, where does this sadness come from?" For some reason, Yi Qian felt that she might have asked the wrong question. Sure enough, the man sitting across from her took a sip of the hot soup and said slowly, "I'm thinking about how to give myself to you." Give myself to him. Fortunately, the soup wasn't hot. Yi Qian resisted the urge to spit out the soup and swallowed it down. After a while, she caught her breath and said rather embarrassedly, "I just came back from a mission, and you're already thinking about giving yourself to me? Every time I go on a mission, the first thing I regret is not giving myself to you. Every time I come back from a mission, I regret not giving myself to you. This cycle has been going on for several years." Xia Jinyuan sighed softly, and the sadness on his handsome face deepened. "This is a problem that has been bothering me for several years. Little fox, why don't you do it with me? You can be harsh, you can be gentle, you can be forceful, you can be forceful. Do it in one go and give me a quick death. What do you think?" Yi Qian, who had almost lost the ability to organize her words, put down her spoon and pushed the plate away. She looked at the man sitting across from her expressionlessly. "Harsh, gentle, forceful, why do I feel like I'm going to be a rapist?" "Captain Xia, are you sure you know what you're saying?" Xia Jinyuan nodded. "I'm sure. It's because I don't feel safe at all. After thinking about it, the only way out is to sacrifice myself." Yi Qian resisted the urge to throw a plate of leftovers at him. He forced a smile and said, "So what you're saying is that you'll feel safe if you give yourself up." Did he get it wrong? He was a man, not a woman. Wasn't the sacrifice referring to women? How could he say that it was a man sacrificing himself to find a sense of security? He had seen scoundrels before, but he had never seen such an unreasonable scoundrel. Yi Qian was both angry and amused. He used his chopsticks to pick up a piece of braised pork and stuffed it into Yi Qian's mouth. "You're offering yourself to me, but I don't dare to accept it. Eat a piece of meat as compensation." 10 years later, eating meat would become a graceful expression of love between a man and a woman. Xia Jinyuan had no idea how a piece of braised pork could compensate him. His gaze deepened and he smiled. "I lack a sense of security. After thinking about it, I still think it's not a bad idea to offer myself to you first. Why don't we do it in a few days?" As pitiful as he was, he still had to rely on offering himself to find a sense of security. Yi Qian did not believe him. He glanced at him and snorted. Save it, Captain Xia. Uncle said that you liked to be a scoundrel since you were young. You mustn't agree to anything easily. He had never seen a father take the initiative to trick his own son. The corners of Xia Jinyuan's mouth twitched slightly. He gritted his teeth at Commander-in-Chief Xia. His son charged forward with the intention of taking over the position in one fell swoop, but in the end, he dragged me back with all his might, and he even had the time of his life. Chapter 23:59. He kept telling him to treat Xiao Yi well and that it was not easy to find a girlfriend like Xiao Yi. Especially someone like you, who doesn't know what to do, it's even harder. If it weren't for your good looks, Xiao Yi would definitely look down on you. If you don't treat Xiao Yi well and a love rival comes along and takes her away, you won't even have a place to cry. Don't even think about entering the family Xiao's door. He made it sound so serious, but in the end, he kept tricking him behind his back. Was he trying to help his son find a wife soon? Or was he purposely making things difficult for him? Little fox, my father doesn't get along with me. When I was young, he liked to find fault with me, and when he grew up, he liked to pick on me. You've seen how he usually treats me. All the sons in the world can do it, but not me. You must be vigilant and not be fooled by him. In order to make himself give himself to her sooner, Lieutenant Colonel Xia began to sigh. You have to trust me, not him. His favorite thing to do is to ruin my plans. Even Old Master and Old Madam often criticize him. Seeing that Commander-in-Chief Xia's words had a huge impact on Yi Qian, Lieutenant Colonel Xia didn't hold back and tried his best to overthrow the image of Commander-in-Chief Xia in his girlfriend's heart. Holding her hand, he said seriously, when I think about how you'll be going back to that military academy with too many young men tomorrow, I really don't feel safe. I'll have to give myself to you. His expression and tone were serious, but the smile in his eyes couldn't be hidden. Yi Qian knew that he was teasing her again. Her watery eyes moved slightly, looking around with sparkling eyes. Really? Why don't we do it now? Here. As long as you're willing, I'll do it any time. Xia Jinyuan saw that she was squinting her eyes. Her curved eyebrows made her look like a sly little fox that was squinting her eyes and basking in the sun lazily. He was laughing in his heart. How could he not know that this little fox in front of him was trying to checkmate him? Looking at her comfortable smile, Xia Jinyuan's deep eyes seemed to be sprinkled with a layer of sunshine that could warm Yi Qian's heart. Yi Qian put down the chopsticks in his hand and propped himself up with one hand on the high table. At the same time, he stretched out his other hand and made a flirtatious gesture. His index finger curled slightly and hooked Xia Jinyuan's delicate chin. Even his expression was somewhat frivolous. Every time I see Captain Xia's face, my imagination does run wild. Yi Qian stood up and leaned toward Xia Jinyuan as he spoke. In the end, their breaths were just inches apart. Just a little bit more, and Yi Qian would have kissed his thin, sexy lips. But she didn't. Under his calm and unruffled gaze, Yi Qian stopped. They were so close that they could see each other's eyelashes clearly. Since Captain Xia is always thinking of giving yourself to me, why don't I fulfill your wish for once? Her eyes sparkled like diamonds and shone like stars. The slyness in the depths of her eyes let Xia Jinyuan know that this little fox didn't really want to fulfill his wish. She just wanted to tease him instead. Sigh, little girl, he really wasn't teasing her. He really wanted to give himself to her. It wasn't just a normal desire, it was an urgent desire. How pitiful. Who would have thought that a dignified demon king like him would have to rely on giving himself to find a sense of security in the end? It was as the saying goes, sooner or later, you'll have to pay for what you've done. Chapter 2360. When Lieutenant Colonel Xia said that he didn't have a sense of security, it wasn't entirely true. Qin Xiu's appearance gave him a wake-up call, making him even more aware that the girl he had grown up holding hands with had already become the most dazzling star, attracting the attention of those sufficiently outstanding adult men. Although he said that he wanted to give himself to her, he actually wanted to stabilize their relationship. Born in a family, Lieutenant Colonel Xia was influenced by his ancestors. Deep in his bones, he still had some feudal thoughts. Once the two of them were husband and wife, they would be husband and wife for the rest of their lives. He desperately wanted to become husband and wife with Yi Qian. He wanted to make this dazzling star completely belong to him. Seeing the sly look in the eyes of the girl in front of him, that pair of eyes that had always maintained a sense of distance from others, when looking at him without the slightest bit of defense, his little fox also liked him and trusted him wholeheartedly. This kind of trust was the most secure button between him and her, and no one else could think of getting between them. Xia Jinyuan said half-truthfully. Seeing that she was teasing him and even flirting with him, Xia Jinyuan's inferiority complex started to stir again. The two of them were too close, and the delicate lips he had been longing for were only a finger's length away. With such a good opportunity in front of him, if he didn't kiss her, he would feel sorry for himself. Thus, while Yi Qian was waiting for his answer, Xia Jinyuan suddenly leaned forward and immediately shortened the distance between their fingers to 0 distance. The two of them were now lips and teeth. Although Lieutenant Colonel Xia had never been in a relationship before, and even his first kiss was offered to Yi Qian, he had a high comprehension ability. Even though they had only kissed a few times, after each kiss, his kissing skills improved by leaps and bounds. After a few kisses, he had a kissing technique that made Yi Qian blush. His nimble tongue invited Yi Qian's soft tongue to dance with him, and he sucked the tip into his mouth slowly. Ever since he was a child, Xia Jinyuan had the habit of chewing peppermint. His breath always had a refreshing and comfortable peppermint flavor, which was Yi Qian's favorite refreshing flavor. When the tip of Yi Qian's tongue was sucked, his kisses alternated between deep and light kisses. Yi Qian, who had been supporting himself with one hand on the round table, had no choice but to support himself with both hands to prevent himself from losing his balance due to his weak knees. Men had a natural desire to conquer, and it existed in every man, especially men like Xia Jinyuan, who were born like kings. Their desire to conquer was far greater than that of ordinary men, and it even carried a sense of dominance. Being teased, he clasped the back of Yi Qian's neck with one hand. As his breathing became heavier, his kiss became deeper and deeper. He did not even let go of the tip of Yi Qian's soft tongue and delicate lips that were like flowers. The temperature in the room seemed to gradually rise, and sweat slowly overflowed from his forehead. His noble and handsome face had a faint trace of rouge, leaving behind a thin layer of color. This was the color of passion. Xia Jinyuan and Yi Qian's skin color had one thing in common: no matter how much they were exposed to the sun, they could not get tanned. Even if they were exposed to the sun, the worst that could happen was a layer of skin peeling off, revealing their fair skin. At this moment, he was aroused. His fair and handsome face had a faint rouge-like color, which made him look even more handsome and elegant. His brows were like mountains and rivers, and only the majestic green mountains could be seen. He was as handsome as a god. Seeing that her breathing was getting heavier, Xia Jinyuan finally stopped his invasion and ended the kiss that made their hearts race. Chapter 2361. He let go of Little Fox in his arms so that she could breathe some fresh air. Little Fox, your lung capacity is still not enough. It needs to be improved. Xia Jinyuan chuckled deeply. His voice was hoarse and so sexy that it made one's ears tingle. Looking at Yi Qian, who was as beautiful as a peach blossom, Xia Jinyuan's dark eyes became even darker. His sexy Adam's apple, which represented his masculinity, couldn't help but move slightly. This kiss was a little deep, kissing to the point that her eyes were moist. Her lips were bright red and slightly opened, revealing her white teeth. Her red lips and white teeth made her look even more beautiful. The more Xia Jinyuan looked at her, the more he felt like his heart was being scratched by 100 cat claws. He hurriedly looked away in embarrassment. Unexpectedly, just as he lowered his eyes, his gaze was locked on her again. He had to admit that the girl he had been protecting had really grown up. She had gradually matured from her initial naivety and was emitting a fruity fragrance that tempted him to commit a crime. His gaze only lingered on her chest for a few seconds before he felt the string called rationality in his brain instantly tighten and straighten. It felt like it would break at any time with her breathing. This is troublesome. He had said half-truthfully that he wanted to succeed. Now, he had really succeeded in the end. Yi Jian was still adjusting her breathing until the feeling of suffocation dissipated a lot. She supported herself with both hands on the round table and looked up at him with her watery eyes. She answered rather stubbornly, "Captain Xia seems to be a little lacking." Otherwise, how could a small kiss make Captain Xia look like he's drunk? Yi Qian didn't even realize that at this moment, her face was as beautiful as a peach blossom. She was so beautiful that Xia Jinyuan, who was separated by the round table, felt so hot that his back was covered in layers of sweat. "Is this a challenge to me?" Xia Jinyuan raised his eyebrows. There seemed to be a small fire in the depths of his dark eyes. The fire sizzled as if it could burn 1,000 miles away. Yi Qian raised his hand to fan himself and answered courageously, "Since that's what Captain Xia thinks, it can be understood that way." She really was a little fox that wasn't afraid of getting into trouble. She actually dared to challenge his rationality at this time. Xia Jinyuan, who had been restraining himself all this while, raised his hand and rubbed his forehead, looking rather worried. Since the letter of challenge had already been issued, how could he refuse? Then let's continue. Xia Jinyuan was a man of action. Soldiers had always been swift and decisive. Since he had made up his mind, he would naturally put it into action. He kissed Yi Qian. He didn't want to be a gentleman, he just wanted to kiss Yi Qian. His long arm wrapped around the back of Yi Qian's neck with great precision. He used an extremely domineering method to make it impossible for Yi Qian to dodge. His lips were once again kissed by him. In a domineering manner, with gentle movements, he carefully and affectionately traced the shape of her lips. He didn't want to say a word. Instead of saying more, he would rather take action and tell her how much he missed her. But no matter how impulsive he was and how tight his heartstrings were, Xia Jinyuan always restrained himself and did not cross the line. Even his hands were very well behaved and didn't move. Since they couldn't cross the line, they could just stick to each other for a little longer. Instead, Yi Qian, who liked to be with Xia Jinyuan, didn't reject kissing him. When they were deeply in love, she took the initiative to greet him and tell him that she actually missed him too. Although the kiss was very gentle, their breathing became erratic. The air in the room also became scorching hot. It was so hot that their foreheads and backs started to sweat. It was so hot that a thin layer of mist formed in their eyes. This was really a kiss that messed up their hearts. Chapter 2362. Compared to Xia Jinyuan's straightforward and undisguised desire, Yi Qian was much more reserved. Her face was as red as the morning sun, and the seductive look in her eyes was like peach blossom petals blown by the wind. It was so seductive that it made Xia Jinyuan even hotter. She was beautiful, too beautiful. She was so beautiful that he was willing to lower his head just to please her. Yi Qian only knew that his knees were so weak that he had to lean on the round table to maintain a stable posture. The lovers who had been separated were reunited, and their feelings for each other were so strong that it was like dry wood colliding with a raging fire. The kiss was out of control. Xia Jinyuan had always known that when he was in front of Yi Qian, his self-control would plummet in a straight line and eventually reach zero. With one hand on the back of her neck, Lieutenant Colonel Xia, who had lost all his self-control, began to feel a little impulsive from the kiss. He was almost unable to control himself. At this moment, Yi Qian, who was about to stand up, mumbled, "Captain Xia, let go of me." Who would have thought that the sentence would turn into mmmmmm and soft moans that could not be formed into words. Xia Jinyuan could clearly hear the string called rationality in his mind snap with a snap. The string called restraint in his heart snapped along with it. While gasping for breath, Xia Jinyuan, who was reluctant to end the kiss, simply used the strength of his lower body to push the round table to the side in a very manly manner. Yi Qian, who was caught off guard, suddenly widened her eyes. She had concentrated all her strength on the round table, and now that the round table was suddenly pushed away by him, Yi Qian's entire body naturally pounced directly into Xia Jinyuan's arms. It was just a kiss with a special forces soldier, but Xia Jinyuan managed to push the round wooden table between them to the side. When Yi Qian pounced over, the young lieutenant colonel happened to hug her. Yi Qian was a little embarrassed. He was not afraid of biting his tongue. She was beautiful, and her voice was even more beautiful. Her beauty carried a hint of seduction, causing him to be completely intoxicated. Xia Jinyuan, who had finally ended the kiss, lifted his head and looked at the girl in his arms. His voice was hoarse as he asked softly, "Little fox, what you said just now, was it true?" What? Yi Qian was very nervous. He was so nervous that he was stuttering. She looked at Xia Jinyuan with her moist eyes, which were like countless little hooks, gently hooking the soul of this special forces soldier. Sacrifice. When I said sacrifice, are you serious? I'm serious now. Xia Jinyuan fixed his gaze on her face and said, "I really want to give myself to you right now." He endured until his forehead was dripping with sweat. Yi Qian could even see a drop of sweat slowly sliding down his handsome face and quietly sinking into the army green shirt he was wearing underneath. The army green shirt was tightly buttoned, and the top button was tightly buttoned. It was so strict that it exuded a sense of abstinence. Yi Qian, who had been staring at the drop of sweat, did not say a word. When the sweat sank into the collar of his shirt, Yi Qian seemed to have felt something and couldn't help but gulp. This action became a silent invitation, a silent agreement. The man, who was standing steadily with Yi Qian in his arms, suddenly had a deep, unfathomable look in his eyes. It was like a deep, unfathomable ancient well. Deep down, there were huge waves, slowly forming a whirlpool that could suck in people's souls. Without stopping, he carried Yi Qian, turned around, and walked towards the bed. Chapter 2363. Yi Qian, who was also sweating from nervousness, supported herself with both hands on his broad shoulders and allowed him to carry her to the bedside. He was deeply attracted to Yi Qian, who was as beautiful as a peach. How could Yi Qian not be attracted to him? At this moment, she was attracted to Xia Jinyuan, who only had eyes for her. Both of them were in love with each other, and their feelings were so strong that Yi Qian didn't have the self-control to reject Xia Jinyuan's offering. Lying on the bed, Yi Qian was so nervous that her hands secretly clutched the quilt. Perhaps because she had been with him for so long, Yi Qian had become bolder. Even when Xia Jinyuan began to unbutton his shirt, Yi Qian opened her eyes wide and didn't close them out of shyness. He had a good figure and wore the military uniform that showed off his military aura. The tailored military uniform made him look even more slender and tall, towering like a mountain. He first took off his jacket and didn't throw it aside carelessly. Xia Jinyuan, who loved and cared for military uniforms, hung the jacket on the coat rack. As he walked over, he raised his hand slightly to unbutton his shirt. Sensing Yi Qian's burning gaze, Xia Jinyuan paused in the middle of unbuttoning his shirt. His handsome eyes, which were slightly surging with emotions, looked over with a smile and caught Yi Qian's unblinking gaze. His thin lips curved slightly. "Little fox, why do you look so interested in me taking off my clothes?" Yi Qian couldn't help but admire beautiful things. At this moment, Xia Jinyuan was undoubtedly beautiful in her eyes. Even the simple act of buttoning his shirt made her heart pound. Hearing this, she admitted frankly, "It's pleasing to the eye. I am indeed very interested." In her heart, she added, "He's even more charming when he's not wearing formal clothes." Although Yi Qian didn't have any opinions about men, she couldn't help but take a second look at men in formal clothes. This was the case in her previous life. She always felt that men who wore suits and leather shoes and went in and out of high-rise buildings were very cultured. In her previous life, she didn't interact with many people and her knowledge was too limited. The security company was located in the most famous financial street in the city, and the office building was in the best location in the entire financial street. The men and women who went out in formal clothes were so confident that they walked with confidence. At that time, she was quite envious of these people. As a result, even though she had lived two lives, she still liked men who wore formal clothes and had a certain temperament and upbringing. Xia Jinyuan looked especially elegant in formal clothes, and when he wore his military uniform, he was fierce and fierce. Due to his temperament, occasionally, when he wore casual clothes, he looked like he was wearing formal clothes. This was exactly what Yi Qian liked. Of course, Xia Jinyuan was very happy that his girlfriend appreciated him. A woman would doll herself up for her lover, and so would a man. Xiao raised his eyebrows slightly and laughed in a low and deep voice. "Why do I feel a little nervous when you see it like this? Why don't you take a step back?" Why would he be nervous? Yi Qian didn't believe him. "Captain Xia, you look very relaxed from head to toe. You're not nervous at all. You just can't see that I'm nervous." Out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at her hands that were clutching the quilt. She was obviously nervous but pretending to be calm. She was like a budding flower, a little shy and a little charming. His heart had already melted into water. He really wanted to hug her and love her. Just the thought of it made the heat in his body go on a rampage. It was like a wild beast that wanted to break out of its cage. It was so crazy that even he was shocked by it. The girl lying on the bed didn't do anything. She was just looking at him with a smile, but it was enough to make him crazy. Chapter 2364. His craziness was even more obvious tonight. He was slightly agitated, which increased his sense of crisis. She also agreed to let them have a deeper understanding of their relationship. She was already not very strong to begin with. Now, she was seducing him so blatantly. Xia Jinyuan's eyes darkened. He looked at Yi Qian gloomily, and his deep voice sounded drunk. "Tonight, no matter how nervous you are, you have to continue. Little fox, you have nowhere to run." Yi Qian knew what he meant by continue. His face burned even more, and he stuttered, "I'm not running away." As she lowered her eyes, her gaze inadvertently swept across the lower half of his body. When she accidentally saw a certain part, Yi Qian's mind exploded with a boom. He reacted so quickly. Seeing his body's honest reaction, Yi Qian swallowed with difficulty and suggested with a dry mouth, "Captain Xia, why don't you take off your clothes with your back facing me?" It was too scary, as if a giant beast was about to rush out. seeing her blushing face, Xia Jinyuan's heart softened. He quickly looked down at his lower body. Not bad, brother, you're giving me face. Bending down, he placed his hands on the edge of the bed and gently kissed her forehead. He was so nervous that his forehead was covered in sweat. After the light kiss, he didn't get up. Instead, he looked at her from a close distance. His deep eyes had a dark look that was determined to win. You can't turn around. I like to look at you, he said in a low voice and got up again. Seeing that she was nervous, he deliberately teased himself to slow down. Unexpectedly, when she saw his body's honest reaction, her little face tensed up again. Yi Qian's heart trembled uncontrollably. His hands clutched the quilt so hard that creases appeared. When Xia Jinyuan got up and took off his clothes quickly, Yi Qian's gaze fell on his slender fingers again. His fingers were long and slender, with well-defined joints. They were elegant and strong. When he held the gun, they were fierce. When he unbuttoned his shirt, they were sexy. After unbuttoning both sleeves, he raised his head slightly and unbuttoned the top button of his shirt with his elegant and slender fingers. After the buttons were unbuttoned, Yi Qian couldn't help but gulp. His voice was a little loud, which made Xia Jinyuan chuckle. He stared intently at Yi Qian and smiled. You seem to be more anxious than I am. It seems like there won't be any problems with my virginity tonight. Yi Qian, who was staring at his fingers, did not seem to have heard what he said. He nodded and said, yes, no problem. This is good. Her answer made Xia Jinyuan's blood flow even hotter. As the first button was unbuttoned, a corner of his shirt was unbuttoned. It was this corner that made him look extremely sexy and seductive. Yi Qian, who was lying nervously on the bed, suddenly felt all the blood in his body rush to his face. In an instant, his face became hot and dry, as if it was on fire. Xia Jinyuan, who was taking off his clothes, kept his gaze fixed on Yi Qian's face. Naturally, he saw all the changes on her face. He saw the surprise in her eyes when he took off his jacket, and the fire in her eyes when he unbuttoned his military uniform. At that moment, Xia Jinyuan realized that his little fox liked to watch him take off his clothes. It seemed that he had misunderstood. He thought that she liked his face, but it turned out that she liked to watch him take off his clothes. With this discovery, Xia Jinyuan knew what he had to do. Since she liked to watch, then he would make her even more satisfied. Chapter 2365. It wasn't just women who targeted men, it was also men who targeted women. The buttons on the light green shirt were unbuttoned one by one. Yi Qian saw the man standing by the bed, revealing a small part of his sexy chest. Then, he pulled out the corner of his shirt that was tucked into his trousers. His slender fingers slid down the edge of the shirt and unbuttoned the last button. Yi Qian felt her mouth go dry. She couldn't help but swallow to moisten her throat. Xia Jinyuan smiled. She looked at him with a burning gaze. It was obvious that his was very successful. He had perfectly locked onto Little Fox's gaze. His thin lips curved slightly. He didn't immediately take off his shirt. Instead, he stopped and looked at Yi Qian with a deep and burning gaze. Compared to taking off his own clothes, he wanted to see her take off his clothes. Yi Qian didn't meet his gaze. Instead, her gaze landed on the shirt that he hadn't taken off completely. From the corner of her eye, she looked at the sexy chest that was faintly discernible under the unbuttoned shirt. As long as he took off his shirt completely, she would be able to see his muscular upper body. Yi Qian waited for him to take off his shirt for a while. She couldn't help but blink. Why isn't he taking off his shirt? She was still waiting for him to take off his shirt completely. Just as she thought about it, Xia Jinyuan's deep and sexy chuckle came from above. His chuckle instantly woke Yi Qian up. She was startled and hurriedly looked away to hide her embarrassment. Her cheeks became even redder and hotter. He must have been laughing at me. I was mesmerized by watching him take off his shirt. Yi Qian was so embarrassed by her behavior that she wanted to get up and run away. Embarrassing, embarrassing, so embarrassing. The blushing Yi Qian made Xia Jinyuan's thin lips curve even higher. He said in a deep voice, "Look here, little fox." Yi Qian, who had already looked away, looked up reflexively. She saw the man who was originally standing slowly leaning down as her gaze landed on him. Yi Qian's eyes widened even more. Her gaze was deeply attracted by his eyes. It was as if there was a magnet in his eyes that had already sucked her into the depths of his soul and she could not escape. "Are you satisfied now? Do you want to have more fun?" He slowly leaned forward and spoke in a low voice. There was an obvious undercurrent in his eyes. Yi Qian couldn't help but tighten his grip on the blanket. Tonight, Captain Xia's sacrifice was most likely going to succeed. She was already tempted by him and wanted to drink water to quench her thirst. Xia Jinyuan, whose shirt was completely unbuttoned, approached Yi Qian. His scorching hot breath was like a giant net, instantly trapping Yi Qian. Yi Qian felt as if her entire body was on fire. She couldn't help but close her eyes, and her hands secretly gripped the blanket even tighter. She was so nervous that even her eyelashes were trembling slightly. She was like a butterfly that had jumped into a flower. Her wings were trembling, making her look pitiful. "Little fox, I've already unbuttoned my shirt and you're helping me take off my clothes." He didn't completely lean down. Instead, he placed his hands on both sides of her shoulders and stared at her with a gentle yet scorching gaze. He coaxed her in the softest voice, "Be good. Raise your hands and help me take off my clothes." This man was also the pinnacle of masturbation. It wasn't like a woman's actions. It was more like an impulse that came from the darkness. Even though he knew it was dangerous, he couldn't help but want to embrace the darkness. This kind of temptation was a temptation to human nature. It was difficult to escape. Yi Qian didn't want to escape. She liked this man's sexiness and loved every part of him. Even if she knew that there was a dark abyss in front of her, she would step forward without hesitation. She would throw herself into the darkness and fall into the abyss. Chapter 2366. She hooked her arms around his neck and used a little strength to pull him close to her. Her red lips parted slightly as she said, "But I prefer to watch Captain Xia take off his clothes." The moment she opened her mouth, Xia Jinyuan's deep and unfathomable eyes suddenly became turbulent. It was as if he would swallow Yi Qian whole in the next second. That gaze made Yi Qian's scalp tighten a little. "You." She had just opened her mouth to say one word when the man, who was originally slightly elegant, came over her like a storm. His tall and straight body pressed against hers, and in the end, his body was tightly pressed against hers, leaving no gap between them. His kiss came with a domineering swallowing force. It was like a stormy wave that broke the dam and drowned all of her rationality. "Yi Jian, my baby," he said in a low voice. His voice made a circle on the tip of his tongue. Although it was vague, it made Yi Jian's heart beat even faster. Thump, thump. Her hands had unknowingly slipped into his unbuttoned shirt. Her scorching palms were pressed against his skin. She could feel the firmness of his skin and feel the blood vessels under his skin expanding. A steady stream of heat seeped through his skin and into her palms. "Injury, your injury. Be careful." At this moment, she still remembered the injury on his body. Xia Jinyuan's kiss was a little hurried. There was sweat dripping from his forehead. His drunken voice was so sexy that it made the air a little intoxicated. It's okay. It's already scabbed. I'll be careful. Slow down. My mouth hurts. Yi Qian mumbled. He kissed her too hurriedly and with too much force. Her delicate petal-like lips were tingling a little. The palms of her hands on his shoulders were also sweating. When she was really nervous, her palms would sweat. He must be very nervous too. His muscles were tense and had lost their elasticity. They were as hard as stone. There was also a thin layer of sweat seeping out from under his skin. Their sweat mixed together, making his shoulders wet and slippery. Thump, 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 his heart was beating so fast that it felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. It was so hard to breathe. The oxygen in the air was so thin that he had to open his mouth to breathe. Her red lips were slightly parted, making it easier for Xia Jinyuan to plunder her. His breathing was also very heavy. His hot breath sprayed onto Yi Qian's face, so hot that even her pores couldn't help but tremble. This time, Xia Jinyuan's kisses did not stop at her lips. As his breathing became more and more shallow, his kisses slid down from her bright red lips to her small and round earlobe. The soft and exquisite feeling made him unable to resist nibbling on it gently with his teeth. Yi Qian's body was already trembling slightly from the scorching hot breath. Suddenly, he was caught off guard and bit his earlobe with the tip of his teeth. His throat let out an uncontrollable moan. It was intermittent, sometimes shallow, sometimes long, sometimes high, sometimes low. This was the first time Xia Jinyuan heard such a sound. His tall and straight body trembled violently as he heard her moan. He was so excited that his handsome and cold eyes were faintly red. Gentler, gentler, it hurts a little. He was so excited that he didn't know how to control his mouth. Yi Qian couldn't help but beg for mercy in a low voice. It couldn't be helped. When it came to sex, Xia Jinyuan was an inexperienced newbie. He had accumulated some experience with the green vegetables and tofu soup from before, but that was only enough for him to handle it with ease in the beginning. As they went deeper into sex, the newbie Xia Jinyuan couldn't control himself anymore. Chapter 2367. If he couldn't hold it in, he wouldn't be able to control his strength. Yi Qian begged for mercy in a low voice to remind him, but it was undoubtedly the wrong time to do so. This reminder was equivalent to directly arousing the hidden beast in the man's body. How could he be gentle? He only had more strength than ever. From her earlobe to her slender, swan-like neck, Xia Jinyuan panted heavily and used all his martial arts skills. It was all an inexperienced kiss. He was so excited that he could even make low, deep sounds in his throat. It was sexy, hoarse, and full of possessiveness. Yi Qian pulled her hands out of his clothes. The stimulation of her senses made her hug his head tightly with both hands. It was like she was rejecting him but welcoming him at the same time. The temperature in the room was even higher. The two people on the bed were already drenched in sweat. Xia Jinyuan realized that his hands were trembling. They were trembling so much that he couldn't even undo a button. Yi Qian felt a little chilly after getting out of bed, so he put on his military uniform. He didn't wear a jacket, only a shirt. This put Xia Jinyuan in a difficult position. Button. His hands were trembling so much that he couldn't undo the button. Fuck. The usually elegant man couldn't help but utter an indecent word at this moment. His handsome face was red from holding it in. His slender fingers stopped at the top button of his shirt. He took a deep breath and was about to undo it again, when he heard a delicate laugh, like the tinkling sound of spring water from the mountains. Yi Qian laughed. She couldn't help it. She had been holding it in for a long time. When she heard his exasperated fuck, she couldn't hold it in anymore. Her Captain Xia, the man she loved. It was the first time he was in such a difficult position. You're still laughing, still laughing. If I knew this would happen, I wouldn't have let you wear it. Being teased by his girlfriend, no matter how thick-skinned Xia Jinyuan was, he couldn't take it anymore. He was afraid that other than laughing, she would say something that would hurt his self-esteem as a man. He sealed her red lips with his as a punishment. Laugh. Let's see how she can laugh. Yi Qian, who rarely saw this side of him, wanted to laugh even more. God, she really did not expect him to be so excited that his hands were shaking. Even though she was very nervous, when she placed her palms on his shoulders, her fluttering heart suddenly felt like it had reached the shore and found the warmest harbor that could shelter her from the wind and rain. Her originally uneasy heart suddenly calmed down and was no longer fluttering. Instead, the place where her heart was at peace was the warmth of her life. He was the peace of mind and the warmth of her life. With great difficulty, she finally got over her shyness and waited for him to offer himself to her. Who would have thought that? His hands would tremble for a long time and he wouldn't be able to undo her buttons. In the end, he angrily cursed, "Fuck. Forgive her for not being skillful enough." After holding it in for a long time, she couldn't help but laugh. Even though he was kissing her, Yi Qian still wanted to laugh. Xia Jinyuan, who was so hot that his back was drenched in sweat, could not help but want to laugh. His hands had never trembled in the face of fierce enemies on the battlefield, but now he was so excited that his hands were trembling. He even wanted to slap himself. What the hell? And his hands were trembling. Burying his head in her neck, the elegant man said in a muffled voice, "Little fox, my man's self-esteem has suffered a huge blow. This will become my dark history. You'd better forget it as soon as possible." It hurt his self-esteem too much, and he brought it on himself. Trembling hands, trembling hands. Go back and bear his weight. Let's see if he can still tremble. Chapter 2368. Yi Qian was in a good mood as he patted his broad shoulders. Don't be angry, don't be angry. It's inevitable that it happens the first time. You may be unfamiliar with it the first time, but you'll get used to it the next time. Does that mean it won't happen this time? Upon hearing this, Xia Jinyuan felt even more frustrated. He lifted his head from her neck and stared at Yi Qian with his dark eyes that were gradually fading away. His voice was still warm as he said, "Do you think I'll be traumatized? Will my hand tremble the next time?" Yi Qian was stumped by his question. He really didn't know if it would happen or not. "Why don't we try again? Maybe we'll succeed if we try again." The man's eyes lit up. The fire in his eyes that was about to extinguish seemed to be reignited. "Little fox, you have to help me. You mustn't be traumatized." Yi Qian could tell that he was doing it on purpose. He cupped his handsome face with both hands and said with a smile, "I promise that my Captain Xia won't be traumatized at all. Your hand trembling just now only meant one thing: Captain Xia isn't ready to give yourself to me yet. Don't worry, I won't force you. It won't be too late to give yourself to me when you're fully prepared. I'll be waiting." After he finished speaking, he even raised his head and kissed his forehead. When he lowered his hand, he also patted his shoulder. He was indescribably gentle and considerate. Xia Jinyuan, whose intentions were exposed, buried his head in her neck again and sucked on her skin with his scorching lips. At the same time, his slender legs shifted slightly so that his lower body, which was originally pressed to the side, was now close to Yi Qian's body. "It's uncomfortable. Feel it." His feet moved slightly. The hard and scorching spot told Yi Qian directly how uncomfortable he was at that moment. Yi Qian coughed awkwardly. His dark, watery eyes turned, and he lowered his head to whisper in his ear, "We'll talk about it later. I told J5 that you were here, so he might come over to look for you later. If he comes over and interrupts again, not only will you be traumatized, even I will be." He was right. Although J5 knew that he was coming, K7 and the others didn't know. His comrades had just returned from a mission, and as the captain, he was here to welcome them back. He couldn't just come here for a date. Xia Jinyuan rolled over to the side of the bed. He took off his shirt and swung it around. His long arms reached over Yi Qian's face and placed the shirt on the bedside table to prevent it from creasing. As she withdrew her hand, she held onto Yi Qian's shoulder and pulled him into her embrace. Her upper body was bare as she embraced Yi Qian. A man's body was different from a woman's. It was masculine and flamboyant. Every part of their body was filled with power. Yi Qian's face was pressed against his face. Her ears, which were already burning, were heated up by his skin texture to the tip of her ears. Seeing the chest muscles that she could only see a small part of before, Yi Qian's fingers, which were tempted by the man, started to move. She reached out and gently poked his smooth muscles with her slender fingers. Once wasn't enough, so she poked twice, thrice. In the end, Xia Jinyuan had no choice but to reach out and grab the hand that was poking at his chest. He said helplessly, "I'm still adjusting myself. I haven't completely softened yet. If you continue, I'm going to burn up again." After taking off his shirt, his burning skin finally felt a trace of coolness. In the end, the little girl in his arms didn't think it was enough. She started to seduce him while he was still in the abyss of suffering. She really had guts. Chapter 2369. If you're going to be so naughty, I need to collect some interest. Seeing Yi Qian's face instantly turn red, the naughty smile on his face deepened. "You poked me so many times, and I only pinched you once and you're already blushing. Then wouldn't I be so embarrassed that I had to cover my head with the blanket just now?" Yi Qian, whose face was as red as blood, poked his chest hard. "Is this the same? Is this the same? You men can go bare-chested on a hot day, but can we do the same?" Xia Jinyuan laughed so hard that his shoulders were shaking. His little fox was so adorable that he wished he could rub her into his body and dote on her. So he did. He took his naughty hand out of her shirt and hugged her tightly in his arms. "Yes, it's not the same. Yours is soft and big, mine is flat and flat. Only you would stare at it for so long. Were you staring at me just now and wishing I could take off my shirt immediately? If I had known, I would have taken off my shirt myself and helped you take it off." There was no medicine for regret in this world. He had never thought that his hands would shake when he undid the buttons. When he returned to the base, he had to teach his trembling hands a lesson. Can't undo the buttons. His darkest history. The dark history that made him feel the most indignant. Yi Qian's face was burning even more when she heard his words, but when she heard his resentful last sentence, she lay in his arms and laughed softly. "If I had known, I wouldn't have known that Captain Xia's hands would shake when he undid the buttons." "You're laughing at me again, aren't you?" Xia Jinyuan felt embarrassed when his darkest history resurfaced. He hugged her tightly and then let go. He lowered his head and kissed her forehead. "Lie down for a while, I'll go take a shower." After the arousal, his body was covered in sweat, so he washed it with cold water to disperse the last bit of his arousal. Yi Qian nodded. At this point, the arousal in their hearts had mostly dissipated. The tension that had been built up with great difficulty was also gradually fading away. If this continued, she would be the one who would feel awkward. However, with this breakthrough, the skin-to-skin contact in the future would come naturally. She would definitely not reject him because of shyness again. Just like just now, although it was just a kiss, it was undeniable that she felt wonderful, as if she had stepped on the clouds. It suddenly rose and fell. It was filled with excitement and anticipation. She thought it would be a wonderful process to do the most intimate thing with the person she loved the most. As Yi Qian listened to the sound of running water in the bathroom, his cheeks flushed as he looked forward to the arrival of midnight. Captain Xia, sacrificing himself. Yes, it's indeed possible. There was a knock on the door, followed by J5's voice. Yi Qian, are you awake yet? Yi Qian leapt out of bed like a carp and lifted the clean white blanket with flying movements. He gently spread it over the bed. As if he had cast a spell, the originally messy bed suddenly became so clean that it looked as if no one had slept in it. Then, she quickly picked up Xia Jinyuan's shirt from the bedside table, tidied it up, and hung it on the coat rack. She then walked to open the door while tidying up her clothes. When she opened the door, J5 saw Yi Qian dressed neatly and heard the sound of running water from his right. J5 instantly coughed awkwardly and said, K7 and the others are in my room. They knew that Q King was coming over, so they wanted to talk to Q King. How much longer is he going to shower? Fortunately, he came 5 minutes later. Otherwise, he would have seen Yi Qian getting dressed and Q King preparing to enter the bathroom. It was obvious that J5 had misunderstood. Chapter 2370. Yi Qian didn't feel like he had exposed anything. He even invited J5 in. He just went into the bathroom. Come in and wait for him. It won't be long. Okay. J5, who had already stepped into the bathroom, suddenly retreated. He smiled and corrected himself. It's okay. I'll go back to my room and wait. You and Q King can come together. Q King went into the bathroom to take a shower. It was obvious that he had just finished exercising. If he went in now, it wouldn't be appropriate. The messy bed would only make things more awkward for him. J5 was certain that Xia Jinyuan and Yi Qian had an unusual relationship just now. Why was he so sure? Because there were 2 red marks on Yi Qian's neck. They were marks from kissing. He hid it well. Yi Qian didn't suspect a thing. He smiled and said, okay, we'll come together later. J5 didn't stop for a moment. He turned around and left. When he heard the sound of the door closing behind him, he raised his hand to wipe the non-existent sweat off his forehead. Luckily, I reacted quickly. Otherwise, I would have been skinned alive by Q King. Xia Jinyuan, who had just put on his pants, came out of the room. He asked Yi Qian why J5 came over just now. Yi Qian, who had helped him get his clothes, smiled and said, K7 and the others are waiting for you in the room. I asked him to sit down and wait for you. He came in and then suddenly left. Xia Jinyuan took the clothes and put them on. When he was buttoning his shirt, his gaze slowly slid past Yi Qian's face and finally landed on her neck. There were 2 kiss marks on her fair skin. Xia Zhongxiao's thin lips curved slightly as he buttoned up his sleeves. J5 might have misunderstood. He wasn't afraid of this kind of misunderstanding. It was just that the thin-skinned little fox would be embarrassed. He said casually while buttoning his cuffs, help me get my jacket. Thanks. Yi Qian took the jacket he had hung up and took it over. He then heard him say, the J5 room is air-conditioned. Wear a jacket. The kiss mark was close to the edge of the shirt collar, so it could be covered with a jacket. On the other side, J5 said to his comrades, be careful when you see Yi Qian later. You are not allowed to look at her neck. She's shy, don't make her feel uncomfortable. V8 was confused. Why would I stare at Qing Niao's neck? I don't even stare at my fiancé's neck. Bah, you don't have a fiancé. J5 sneered. V8 grinned. That's right. That's why I haven't even looked at my fiancé's neck. Why would I stare at Qing Niao's neck for no reason? K7, who was a forensic doctor, seemed to have guessed something. His cold lips twitched, revealing a smile that could be considered a smile. You saw something you shouldn't have seen. G3, who had a girlfriend and their relationship had improved a lot, also reacted. He let out a long "oh" and laughed. Looks like our captain acted fast. I think I guessed something, but I'm not sure if I'm right. A deep smile appeared on T6's delicate baby face. He glanced at V8, who was still clueless about the situation. When he received his comrade's inquiring gaze, he deliberately dragged out his words. It's that, right? What do you mean by that? Shuang, who had also just woken up and was eating dinner, said vaguely, I don't understand. J5 glanced at all the men in the room and stood up. Chapter 2371. He had to go back and remind them. He had almost forgotten that only a few people in the brigade knew about Q King and Qing Niao. His reminder just now was actually more of a hindrance. The Snowfield Brigade had sent out 11 people for this mission, G3 had 7 people, and J5 had 4 people excluding Yi Qian. Now that they were all sitting in one room, the entire room seemed even smaller. Let's talk in the conference room. The room is too small, and Q King won't be able to sit here later. J5 gave G3 a look. He was going to remind Yi Qian that the others would be led to the conference room by G3. V8 still wanted to ask why they couldn't look at Yi Qian's neck, but T6 dragged him away. What's there to look at a girl's neck for? J5 is reminding us not to look at anything below the face. Don't ask so many questions, this is a sign of respect. V8 felt that his intelligence had been insulted. Looking below the neck, was that a sign of disrespect? T6 did not give him a chance to speak again. He was partners with V8, so even if this guy farts, he would know what it meant. His words were crude but not crude, showing that they understood each other very well. Among the comrades who came out this time, there were a few who were not familiar with Yi Qian. This morning, they met for the first time. Although they had introduced themselves, they were not very familiar with each other. Regarding Q King and Yi Qian, it was better not to let too many comrades know about it for the time being. At least, not now. Other than V8, there were also a few people who did not quite understand. The main reason was that no one knew that Xia Jinyuan was in Yi Qian's room, so naturally, they did not think in that direction. Outside the room, Xia Jinyuan was about to knock on the door when it suddenly opened. There are too many people, we're going to the conference room, G3 said. At the same time, his gaze passed over Xia Jinyuan's shoulder and landed on Yi Qian, and he nodded slightly. The light in the corridor was white and bright. Yi Qian, who was standing in the light, looked beautiful. Her expression was even more relaxed and elegant. There was nothing different about her. Looking at her neck, G3 wondered if J5's eyes were playing tricks on him. How could there be a problem? There was nothing wrong with being white and tender. Xia Jinyuan and Yi Qian sensed G3's gaze at the same time. One of them didn't comment, while the other thought of something. Their expressions instantly became unnatural. No wonder J5 suddenly said that he wouldn't enter the room. He must have found out. Just now, Captain Xia had been sucking on her neck, so he must have left a mark. J5 saw it but did not say anything out of consideration for her reputation. Yi Qian only felt that her face was burning a little. But in the face of more than 10 comrades, no matter how unnatural it was, he had to maintain his composure. The Border Defense Company's office was a little far away. Although the rain outside wasn't heavy, it still didn't seem like it was going to stop. The soldiers of the Frontier Company invited the Snowfield Brigade into the reception room of the building. The reception room was only the size of a dormitory. It didn't have a large bed, so it seemed empty. Yi Qian met 3 new comrades of the Snowfield Brigade. One of them was from the land of abundance. He was introverted and looked like a southerner. His code name was Y2. Another one was from the Lost Plateau. He was a rough and steady man from the northwest. His code name was E6. The last one was from the Jin province. He graduated from the Computer Science Department of Tsinghua University. His code name was X. He didn't have a number. When he introduced himself, he said that X and Y had a functional relationship. Y had a number, so he didn't need one. Y2 and X both graduated from the Computer Science Department of Tsinghua University. Because they hacked a main website, they were targeted by the Snowfield Brigade. After a week of threats and promises, they were so scared that they didn't even get their diplomas and quickly reported. From then on, the Snowfield Brigade had 2 more experts in electronic warfare. Chapter 2372. The Snowfield Brigade was a place where talents gathered. Every member of the Snowfield Brigade was highly educated. They were all elites in the military and were all extraordinary. Yi Qian gradually forgot about the awkwardness as he interacted with them. However, she remembered that there was a kiss mark on her neck, so she sat obediently and didn't dare to move too much. J5 and K7 also blocked her so that Yi Qian would feel more at ease. Xia Jinyuan looked at them and felt a little uncomfortable trying to hold back his laughter. Finally, he put his arm around J5 and K7's shoulders and said with a smile, "You two don't have to block her. The more you block her, the more uncomfortable she will feel. Just pretend that nothing happened." He knew that his comrades had good intentions, but their good intentions could sometimes lead to bad things. He had already suffered countless daggers from Little Fox sitting there. He had a premonition that tonight's sacrifice would be full of twists and turns. If his comrades continued to cover for Little Fox, in the end, he would be the one to suffer. When J5 and K7 heard this, they reflexively turned to look at Yi Qian. Xia Jinyuan said calmly, "Don't look. She's already uncomfortable enough. If you look again, she'll know what I told you. Brothers, give me a way out. It's not easy to get a girlfriend these days. Don't you think so?" That's right. In this day and age, especially for men like them who lived on the edge of a knife, it was too difficult to find a girlfriend. Take G3 for example. He went to the poor mountainous area to teach his girlfriend and he had to chase her for a long time before he finally got her. After this mission, he would go back to his hometown to hold an engagement party and get his marriage certificate. Then, he would rush back to the army a week later to train for the international competition. With Xia Jinyuan's reminder, the two didn't pay much attention to Yi Qian. This made Yi Qian feel a lot more at ease. Project X was talking about how he was scared into joining the Snowfield Brigade. Y2 and I were so scared that we didn't dare to sleep in the middle of the night. At that time, we were very timid and thought that we were being targeted by some big shot that we couldn't afford to offend. We were afraid that we would lose our lives if we weren't careful. After a week, Y2 and I lost a total of 5 kilograms. 5 kilograms. Then, guess what happened? Our Qing Miao. Yi Qian listened with great interest and asked with a smile, "What happened?" Because Y2 and I were overweight. If we didn't lose weight, we wouldn't be able to meet the team. We were scared and we lost 5 kilograms. We met the team. Our comrades, for half a year. We slept in the mountains, we ate our food, and we were all taken by helicopters. Y2 foot S's families is twos. Our where? The story of every comrade in the Snowfield Brigade was like a book, a story. The content of the story was full of ups and downs, and it was fascinating. Listening to such a story, with such a group of people sitting around him, Yi Qian looked at their military uniforms and thought of the civil war in the neighboring country. He thought of the civilians of the neighboring country who sacrificed their lives in the artillery fire. His mood fluctuated. Our country's military's protection. That's why she dared to enter the neighboring country without any worries. She even had the guts to hold a gun in her hand and point it at the enemy who threatened her. She can go abroad without fear, and she can return to her country confidently. Chapter 2373. It was precisely because of this group of Army Green soldiers who treated life and death lightly and protected the country's dignity as if it were their own lives that the country and its people could be at peace. Yi Qian was so immersed in his comrades' stories that he forgot about the hickeys on his neck. Xia Jinyuan, who was sitting next to him, sighed in relief. At the same time, he couldn't help but wonder if he could share his own story as well. Outside, Qin Xiu asked which room Yi Qian was staying in. As he had to return to Beijing early, he knocked on Yi Qian's room. After 3 knocks, he smiled and said, "Yi Qian, it's me, Qin Xiu." It was very quiet inside, as if there was no one inside. Qin Xiu looked at the room number. There was no mistake. It was indeed Yi Qian's room. Could he have gone to another room? The staff member from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who had accompanied him back to Beijing, reminded him softly. There are quite a lot of soldiers in the army this time. Maybe he went to look for his comrades. The scene he saw during the day flashed through Qin Xiu's mind. His elegant face became slightly gloomy. Maybe, let's go. He didn't continue to knock on the door or look for him. He sighed softly and turned around to leave. Yi Qian's room was also on the 2nd floor. The difference was that Qin Xiu's room was on the other end of the 2nd floor, while Yi Qian's room was on the other end. The two of them, one at the front and one at the back, didn't know that the other was staying on the same floor. It was already 10 p.m. Qin Xiu had to catch a flight at 2 a.m. The Border Defense Company was quite far from the airport, so it would take him nearly 2 hours to reach the airport. 10 minutes ago, he received news that he would be returning to Beijing overnight. He packed his room and immediately set off. Now, he didn't have enough time to look for Yi Qian. Downstairs, Yi Qian was saying good night to Xia Jinyuan and the others. At the same time, he glared at Xia Jinyuan, who wanted to follow him upstairs. He and his comrades personally escorted him back to his room, then he returned to the 2nd floor alone. Someone came down from the 2nd floor. Yi Qian looked up and saw Qin Xiu, who was halfway down the stairs and was about to come down. Qin Xiu. You are returning to Beijing overnight. Yi Qian's gaze fell on the small black suitcase in his hand. When he came from Beijing, he was carrying the same suitcase that all diplomats carried. Qin Xiu, who had given up on saying goodbye, did not expect to see Yi Qian at the corner. A light flashed across his eyes, and he smiled. Well, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs called. I have to leave early. He Xiu, Yi Qian, Yi, Qin Xiu of course, Yi. Sorry, I went to the reception room to chat with my comrades. Yi Qian was a little embarrassed. He went to say goodbye to her, but she wasn't in her room, so it was a little rude of him. Now that they ran into each other, he had to take the initiative to send her off. What she didn't know was that the smile in Qin Xiu's eyes deepened because of her explanation. No wonder you weren't in the room. You went to chat with your comrades. Did you sleep too long during the day and can't sleep at night? As he walked down, Yi Qian naturally turned to send him off and went downstairs with him. Qin Xiu's lips curled up slightly. I slept too much during the day. When I woke up, it was already dark. I don't feel sleepy anymore. Yi Qian replied. In the misty light, her eyes were not as sharp as usual, and she looked exceptionally gentle. Qin Xiu glanced at Yi Qian out of the corner of her eye, and her heart thumped. Chapter 2374. It was raining outside. Even if he wanted her to walk him to the car, he had to stop. He turned around and looked at her with his dark eyes. Let's go upstairs. It's raining, so it's not easy to walk. There was no way for the car to drive downstairs, so he had to walk. Yi Qian looked at the rain and pointed at his trousers. Roll up your trousers. There's a lot of mud outside. Be careful not to dirty your trousers. The Border Defense Company's barracks were still under construction. The two-story building they were staying in had just been built, and the greenery outside had not been completed yet. It was not easy for cars to enter, and the roads were not easy to walk on. When the rain flowed through, it became muddy water mixed with yellow soil. Yi Qian thought of Qin Xiu's cleanliness, so she reminded him. Qin Xiu smiled. I'm not obsessed with cleanliness, but I have to pay attention to my image at all times. Over time, it became a habit. Although he said that, he still bent down and carefully rolled up his trousers. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs staff next to them smiled. People who were obsessed with cleanliness usually did not think they were obsessed with cleanliness. Yi Qian also smiled. If he was not in a hurry, she would have counted on her fingers and told him all the things she knew about his obsession with cleanliness. Qin Xiu opened the large black umbrella and held the handle. Under the umbrella, his elegant features nodded slightly at Yi Qian with a smile. In the dense light, there was a touch of gentleness in his gentle eyes. Before Yi Qian could notice, he lowered the edge of the umbrella and the shadow of the umbrella covered his eyes. He turned around and walked into the darkness with his slender, bamboo-like back and slowly disappeared. Ambassador, that female soldier just now, was she the one who accompanied you out? The accompanying staff asked curiously. She's so beautiful. When you two stand together, I feel my eyes light up. He wanted to praise Yi Qian's beauty, but he was afraid that it would be frivolous to say it alone, so he praised Qin Xiu as well. Usually, when Qin Xiu heard such words, he would just laugh and ignore them. Today, however, he was interested. He said, "Oh," and smiled. Why do you think so? They're both good-looking. They look like a good match. The staff member laughed. He was telling the truth. A handsome man and a beautiful woman standing together was indeed very compatible. At least, in terms of appearance, they were very compatible. Do they look like a good match? Qin Xiu shook his head lightly. In the rain and wind, his faint sigh could be heard. What he wanted was not to look like a perfect match, but a perfect match. He didn't continue talking to the staff. He didn't want others to see through his thoughts. Everything was still unclear, and there were many things that hadn't been clarified yet. For the time being, he couldn't let anyone know. If Yi Qian didn't have a boyfriend and there were rumors that he liked her, it would be fine. But if she really did have a boyfriend and there were similar rumors, it would be unfair to her. In this world, men were always exceptionally tolerant and women were always harsher. Yi Qian had relied on her own hard work to get to where she was today. He didn't want to ruin her start because of some rumors. He didn't have the right to do so. The staff member was actually still chatting excitedly. But when he saw that Qin Xiu didn't continue, the staff member, who more or less understood his personality, chose to end the conversation at the right time. The rain fell on the umbrella, and the pitter-patter sound was somewhat hurried, as if urging people to return quickly. Yi Qian stood by the corridor until his figure completely disappeared from her sight. Only then did she turn around and go upstairs. She turned around and unintentionally swept her gaze forward. She saw the man she had escorted back to her room standing at the door. His body was leaning lazily against the door frame. She didn't know how long he had been looking at her with a smile on his handsome face. Chapter 2375. Yi Qian smiled brightly, pointed to the room, and whispered, "Be good and go back to your room, Captain Xia." Listening to the story tonight was indeed very enjoyable, but at the same time, she did not forget about the hickeys on her neck, which made her feel very embarrassed. Xia Jinyuan knew that his sacrifice tonight would be full of twists and turns, so he closed the door behind him and walked over elegantly. He glanced at the dark rainy night in front of him and asked, why is he in such a hurry to leave? Back to the capital. He said that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs called and asked him to return to the capital. It should be something urgent. After Yi Qian answered, he looked at the man standing beside him warily and asked, "Why did you come out?" "I'm going back to my room to sleep." "You should rest early." Then, he pretended to yawn. She was found out by her comrade. She was so embarrassed, Xia Jinyuan smiled slightly and said, "I slept too much during the day. When I woke up, it was already dark. I don't feel sleepy anymore." "I heard you talking to him just now, huh?" "Why, you're telling me you want to sleep with me?" That was a little seductive and had a deeper meaning. He slowly bent down and looked at Yi Jian with a smile in his dark eyes. His thin lips curled up a little as he said slowly in a naughty manner, "Do you want to sleep with me?" Yi Qian looked over with a smile in his eyes and said, "I already slept with you. I should rest tonight." When chatting with Captain Xia, she had to constantly remind him to be thick-skinned. Otherwise, he would definitely be at a disadvantage and teased by him again. After a few years of working together, Yi Qian already had his own experience. Xia Jinyuan loved to exchange words with her. In the dim light, his tall and broad body leaned towards Yi Qian. Yi Qian leaned back, but he continued to move closer and said with a faint smile, "You slept with me, so shouldn't you take responsibility? How come you've just slept with me, and now you're turning against me? You slept with me, so I have to sleep with you too. That's only fair, right?" Who would talk about fairness with him? Yi Qian, who knew that his kung fu was insufficient, smiled faintly. Then, he quickly turned around and ran upstairs. Seeing this, Xia Jinyuan laughed in a low voice. How could she be so adorable? He really wanted to hug her and rub her in his arms. He still had to wait for a while before he went to sleep. He still had some important matters to discuss. In the end, Xia Jinyuan entered Yi Qian's room and successfully laid down on a bed. He put an arm around her shoulder and talked about the mission with the J5. "Your combat style is quite fierce, and your momentum is fierce. While making your comrades feel at ease, they are also worried. They are worried that you will suddenly move forward with the next step of the battle plan, and they are also worried that they can't keep up with your pace. I discussed with J5 for a while, and we agreed that it wasn't your fault. The main reason is still us. Also, you haven't done any daily coordination training with the team. Although you have experience fighting together, you still lack a certain degree of tacit understanding." Yi Qian listened very seriously. At the same time, she was also thinking about whether she was too impatient. Sometimes, she really wanted to complete the next step of the battle plan as soon as possible, but every time she had this thought, she would remember what he said: collective combat is teamwork, not individual action. Remember not to make individual mistakes that will affect the entire battle situation. Whenever she thought of what he said, she would endure it. She didn't expect J5 to see through her. She pursed her lips and said seriously, "I will change these bad habits." Chapter 2376. It's not a problem. The main problem is that you still need to improve your tacit understanding and cooperation. When I return to the military, I plan to make a request to see if you can come to the base alone to train with us during the winter and summer vacations. Tacit understanding and cooperation can't be developed in a day or two, but over a long period of time. Also, you're much better than us in a certain aspect, so we have to keep up with your pace. There's no problem of you waiting for us. No strong person will slow down and wait for the weak to catch up. Don't feel pressured. Everything can be solved with tacit understanding and cooperation. Yi Qian thought for a moment and asked, "Did I hold the J5 back during this operation?" "Why would you think so?" "No, you performed very well, especially when you broke out of the encirclement with one wheel." It was an eye-opener for them. Hearing the uncertainty in her voice, Xia Jinyuan lowered his head and kissed the top of her head. "You did very well, little fox. You're the greatest pride of my life." Yi Qian heaved a sigh of relief and felt a little embarrassed by his praise. She hugged his muscular waist with one hand and replied seriously, "You're my pride too." The interaction between lovers was filled with endless words of love. In addition to words of love, Yi Qian and Xia Jinyuan also talked about training, combat, missions, and other topics. They talked about the operation and the international competition. Before they knew it, the time had passed from night to morning. Yi Qian didn't even know when he fell asleep. When he opened his eyes, he realized that the man who said he would give himself to him last night didn't stay the night. He didn't know when he left either. He had no impression of him at all. Yi Qian pulled open the curtains and saw the light blue sky. Although the sun hadn't risen yet, it was clear that it was a sunny day. He stood on the second floor and looked into the distance. The world that had been washed by water was green and full of vitality. The new barracks were built at the foot of a mountain surrounded by green hills and clear waters. The training ground for the Border Defense Company was still in the old barracks. When Yi Qian came down for his morning jog, he only saw the Border Defense Company sentinels standing guard. As for his comrades from the Snowfield Brigade, Yi Qian looked at the rows of tightly shut doors behind him and wondered if they had already woken up. Yi Qian did not knock on the door. Instead, he walked out of the new building. As soon as he reached the door, he saw Xia Jinyuan striding towards him. When he saw her, he quickened his steps and soon, he was right in front of her. He smiled and said, "Go upstairs and pack your luggage first. I'll send you straight back to the military academy later. You, just send off another comrade." He was dressed neatly, and he didn't look as drowsy as when he had just woken up. His golden epaulets were stained with rainwater, but it was unknown whether it was rainwater or dew. Yi Qian couldn't help but look back at the new building behind him. Why did they all leave so early? She didn't even send them off. Xia Jinyuan followed her back to the new building. His strides were a little long, as if he had something urgent to attend to. Something came up at the base. "We left at 2:30 a.m. and will arrive at the base in an hour." What was so urgent? He didn't say, and Yi Qian didn't ask. She had no right to ask if he didn't say anything. But if his other comrades were in a hurry to go back, why didn't he, as the brigade leader, return to the base? Yi Qian went back to her room and put some clothes into her military travel bag. When she came out, she said to the man waiting for her downstairs, "I can go straight back to the military academy myself. If you have something to do, go ahead. I don't need you to accompany me back." Her gaze fell on his waist. "I saw it last night. The wound on your waist is still there. Don't send me back to the military academy. I'll go back by myself." Chapter 2377. If he sent her to the military academy, he would definitely have to take a plane and leave immediately. She didn't want him to work so hard. Xia Jinyuan took the light luggage from her hands and smiled. "Although I don't have much time off, I still have time to send my girlfriend back to school. Also, I just received a call from my third brother. He has something to tell you. I'll tell you as we walk." Half an hour ago, Family Xia's third brother, who was in charge of missile research and development, called and replied to what Xia Jinyuan had asked him to find out. Yi Qian strode after him and frowned slightly. "It'll take a few hours to get back to the military academy. What's so important that you need to talk about it for a few hours? Captain Xia, you need to rest now. I don't want anything to happen to you." In the end, Yi Jian's voice became extremely solemn. "I still have 3 days off. Little fox, if I can, I want to spend all 3 days with you." Xia Jinyuan tilted his head and said softly, "We don't spend much time together. Now that I have time, I just want to be with you. I want to see you more and talk to you more." His low voice was heavy and filled with helplessness. Yi Qian didn't say anything else. "Me too," she replied softly. Those few words were so affectionate that it made Xia Jinyuan's heart melt. She missed him as much as he did. "Just like how you took good care of yourself for me, I will take good care of myself too." After they walked out of the new building, Xia Jinyuan quickly lowered his head and kissed Yi Qian's cheek. "Don't worry about my injury. After I send you back to school today, I'll take a plane back to Beijing tonight." Yi Qian couldn't leave the military academy at night. Even if Xia Jinyuan was on leave, he had to go back early. Xia Jinyuan insisted, so Yi Qian took a step back. When they were about to get into the car, she gently pulled on his finger and said softly, "Take me to the airport. Don't go to my school. The flight back to Beijing is after 7. There's not enough time to take me to school." If he took her to school, he would have to go back to the airport immediately. The bumpy ride back and forth was too tiring. "All right, I'll listen to your arrangements this time." Since she had already taken a big step back, he naturally had to take a step back as well. The relationship between the two of them did not necessarily have to be competitive and win. The occasional concession was just to make the other person feel more comfortable. With his agreement, Yi Qian's footsteps became lighter as he got into the car. When they got into the car, Yi Qian realized that he was talking about his father. Yi Qian's father, Fu Yuxing, was the chief engineer of a certain missile base in the northwest. Xia Jinyuan's third brother was also working at a certain missile base in the northwest. When he found out about this from old Master Fu's house, he asked his third brother to look into it. He received a call this morning with the latest news. "Your father and my third brother are in the same production base. However, your father is the chief engineer in charge of another project. My brother doesn't have much contact with your father." This time, when he asked around, he found out that your father isn't at the base for the time being. As for where he went, my third brother doesn't know. Wherever a chief engineer goes is a secret. Even his closest colleagues don't know. Suddenly hearing the latest news about his biological father, Yi Qian's face stiffened. After a while, he said, "Really? Then the letter I wrote probably won't reach him so soon." It mainly depends on when my father-in-law will come back. My brother only knows that my father-in-law isn't at the base. He doesn't know when he will leave or return to the base. Xia Jinyuan naturally changed the way he addressed his father. He called him father-in-law, as if they had been father and son-in-law for several years. Chapter 2378. Yi Qian, whose expression was a little stiff, couldn't help but laugh when he heard this. He joked, "Captain Xia, you really know how to make connections. Don't call him that too early. What if your father-in-law doesn't like it? I've already passed the old man's test, so I definitely won't have any problems with my father-in-law." Xia Jinyuan was very confident. He didn't expect that the future father-in-law he called so happily would make him suffer so much later on. Yi Qian saw this and the smile on his face deepened. He always attached great importance to her and would always think of her first in everything. He would always be the first to make arrangements. This kind of Captain Xia always made her very happy. She picked up the small bag beside her and placed it on her lap. Then she tugged at Xia Jinyuan's sleeve from under the bag. The two of them exchanged glances. Xia Jinyuan smiled and reached out to hold her hand from under the bag. It was just a date and a simple handshake with his girlfriend. Did he have to be so sneaky? Yi Qian was worried that the soldiers driving them to the airport would see them. Xia Jinyuan understood what she meant, so he let her be. As long as she liked it, it was fine. The soldiers drove them all the way to the airport. After arriving at the airport, Xia Jinyuan went to a small shop selling local specialties and bought a notebook and a pen. Yi Qian didn't know his intentions until they boarded the plane. The plane took off on time and soared into the clouds. Not long after, Xia Jinyuan handed the notebook and pen to Yi Qian. He smiled and said, "Open it and take a look." The plane was full. One of them was wearing a military uniform, while the other was wearing a cadet's uniform. Even though they were sitting together, they were well behaved. They had to be careful when they spoke and couldn't say or do anything that would damage their image as soldiers. Yi Qian smiled and took the notebook. He opened it and immediately closed it. His dark eyes glared at Xia Jinyuan. "I'm very sorry that I didn't succeed in giving myself to you last night." Such a sentence was written in the notebook. Yi Qian glanced at it, and the tips of her ears became a little hot. His hand unconsciously touched his neck. Luckily, it was still early spring when he returned to the military academy, so he would be wearing the uniform of the military academy. If it was summer, he wouldn't even be able to cover the kiss mark. Seeing this, Xia Jinyuan's handsome face slowly broke into a smile. He took the notebook from her hand and slightly touched the tip of the pen before handing it back to her. "Take a look again." "Can I not look?" Yi Qian cleared his throat and glanced at the passenger sitting on the other side of the aisle. They were seated in 2 rows of business-class seats. Fortunately, there was no one beside them. Otherwise, Yi Qian would have maintained a serious expression and refused to chat with the men beside him. Xia Jinyuan smiled and shook his head. "I can't not watch it." When he looked again, the corners of Yi Qian's mouth, which he had pretended to be suppressing, curved upwards uncontrollably. "She's so beautiful that it makes my heart flutter." His handwriting was very stylish. The strokes were clear and sharp, and there was a sense of openness between the curvature. His handwriting was like his person, excellent. Yi Qian's handwriting was also very beautiful. Every word was beautiful and sharp. She wrote, "Captain Xiao's figure is very good. It makes my heart flutter. Unfortunately, my hand trembled in the end and ruined the mood. You want to flirt with me? Then let's flirt together." She finished writing in a serious manner and handed the notebook over. Xia Jinyuan opened it and the smile in his eyes deepened. She didn't use her mouth but instead used a pen. She was even more daring and directly exposed his dark history. The flight was 3.5 hours long. During these 3.5 hours, the two of them only exchanged notes. They didn't make any blatant moves. They flirted back and forth with each other, as well as sweet words between lovers. This was also a kind of fun to get along with. When they got off the plane, the notebook was already half finished. Chapter 2379. The two of them didn't check in any luggage. After they walked out, Xia Jinyuan put the notebook into his military travel bag and smiled at Yi Qian. This is my most precious memory. When we return to Beijing, I'm going to lock it in a safe. When we're old, we can take it out and look at it. At the same time, we can tell the younger generation how we fell in love. Seeing him put the notebook in the bag and patting the camouflage travel bag, Yi Qian smiled like a crescent moon. Keep it well. Treat it like a family heirloom. They laughed and talked about the pain of separation. Before Xia Jinyuan sent her to the bus, he pulled her to a secluded place in the airport and made out with her for a while. They kissed until Yi Qian's lips were bright red and a little swollen. Only then did he reluctantly send her to the bus and leave. Yi Qian deliberately sat at the back of the bus. Through the glass of the bus, he waited until he could no longer see the figure that was watching him leave before he sat back down. Separation was a common thing for the two of them. But even if it was a common thing, every time they parted, the bitterness in their hearts was unbearable. Yi Qian opened the window and let the cool breeze blow in. Only then did he manage to hold back the bitterness in his eyes. When he said that when they got off the plane, he was just trying to make her laugh. Family heirloom. How could a notebook be a family heirloom? But it was indeed a memory that belonged to them. She didn't know what was so urgent at the base that they had to leave at 2:30 in the morning. They left so quietly and without a sound. Leaving in such a hurry. There must be something urgent. After parting with Xia Jinyuan, Yi Qian was a little uneasy. The image of Xia Jinyuan looking down at his phone when she got on the bus flashed through her mind. Even his eyebrows were sharp and cold. It was obvious that they had indeed encountered something urgent. Xia Jinyuan had indeed encountered something. It wasn't an urgent matter, but a matter that concerned the outcome of the competition. He waited until the bus was out of sight before he turned and returned to the airport. He didn't have time to feel bitter about separation. After sending Yi Qian off, he called the base. All the members of the Snowfield Brigade had suddenly returned to the capital ahead of schedule because they had joined two of the world's top special forces for the overseas tournament. As for the Chinese side, it was their first time participating in an overseas competition. In the face of a sudden opponent, they had to improve their individual combat ability to the maximum within a limited time. The Storm Commandos have sent a total of 6 comrades over. They'll arrive at the base in about half an hour. You don't have to rush. Just return to the base on time. J5, who answered the phone, quickly answered Xia Jinyuan's question. His voice was deep and tense, and Xia Jinyuan could hear the nervousness in his heart. There are still a few months to prepare. I hope there will be a big improvement. Standing in a secluded corner of the airport, Xia Jinyuan's handsome face swept away the gentleness he had when interacting with Yi Qian. His gaze was as cold as an arrow as he said in a deep voice, "According to the weekly plan I previously set, the training will be carried out step by step. The Storm Commandos need targeted training. Let the Demon King list all the shortcomings in their team as soon as possible." The addition of the 2 top special forces made the Storm Commandos and the Snowfield Special Forces feel unprecedented pressure. After sending Yi Qian off, Xia Jinyuan had yet to arrive at the base. He had already entered a state of intense training. For the time being, Yi Qian didn't know that the two teams had entered the joint training in advance. After taking the bus back to school from the airport, she transferred to another bus. When she got off the bus, it was already 5:20 in the afternoon. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.